Hello, my dear friends. If your wedding night was watched by relatives, your bloody sheets were kept as evidence, and a rumour about your sexual activity was enough to embarrass your entire clan, then you were living in the world of the Vikings. For them, sex was not a private matter, but something public, monitored, and used to measure human worth. Honour, power, and even survival were all tied to what happened in bed. Tonight, join me in delving into some of the most shocking sexual practices that the Vikings considered normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you think modern funerals are uncomfortable, you might want to skip what happened in 922 AD. That year, a Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan was sent to Eastern Europe on behalf of the Abbasid Caliphate. His job was to deliver a letter and maintain relations. He didn't go looking for culture shock, but when he arrived in the land near the Volga River, he met a group of Norsemen. We now call them Vikings. One of their chieftains had died. Ibn Fadlan was invited to witness the funeral. What he saw was not something he could forget. The Vikings didn't bury people with silence and flowers. They prepared a wooden ship to serve as the dead man's final resting place. They placed his body on it. They added weapons, armour, animals, and food. But that wasn't all. They needed someone to accompany him, a living person, a slave girl. She didn't step forward immediately. The tribe asked who would go with the chief. After some time, one girl agreed. From that moment on, her life was no longer hers. Over the next several days, the girl was treated as part of the funeral process. She was given alcohol and herbal drugs. Then she was taken to various tents. In each one, a man had sex with her. This was not hidden. The tribe believed this ritual transferred energy. Each man whispered that it was for the dead chief. That was what they were doing would help him in the next world. The girl cried, but no one stopped. Everyone believed this was the right thing to do. It's disturbing how everyone around her acted like this was completely normal, like passing around a cup at a feast. She was cleaned and dressed in fine clothing. Her eyes were painted. Her hair was braided. She was led to the funeral ship where her master's body had been laid out. On that final day, 6 more men had sex with her while people watched. It was quiet. No one laughed. No one seemed bothered. After the final man stepped away, an older woman entered the ship. She was called the Angel of Death. Her role was clear. She took a thick cord and wrapped it around the girl's neck. At the same time, another person stabbed her in the ribs. The girl struggled for a few seconds. Then she stopped. They placed her body next to the chief, arms folded, eyes closed. The ship was set on fire. The flames rose, and the tribe began chanting. Ibn Fadlan stood and watched. He did not interfere. He did not argue. He simply observed and later wrote down what he saw. Every detail, no added emotion, no exaggerated language, just what happened. For years, historians thought he must have invented the entire event, but then archaeologists began finding graves that looked just like the one he described. In Norway, the Osberg ship was discovered. Inside were the remains of 2 women. One of them showed signs of violent death. Other ship graves across Scandinavia had similar details: a man of high status, a younger woman, signs of ritual killing. Tools, animal bones, ceremonial items, the pattern repeated. The story Ibn Fadlan told was real. It was not a myth, it was Viking practice. Compared to this, today's cremations with soft music and polished urns feel like quiet business meetings. The Vikings made funerals into events, public ones. The dead did not go alone. They took objects, animals, and sometimes people. Not everyone was given this kind of funeral. It was mostly for leaders, for men of power. The more important the person, the more elaborate the death. The slave girl wasn't seen as a person anymore. She became a part of the ritual. The tribe didn't mourn her. They didn't cry over her. They believed she had a purpose, to help the dead man arrive in the next world with strength and honour, to carry part of the living world with him. Her death was seen as necessary. It was not about cruelty. It was about tradition. This belief was so strong that no one seemed to question it, not even her. Once she agreed to die, the rest was automatic. She followed instructions. She drank what they gave her. She allowed what they demanded. She walked onto the ship without resistance. Her part was clear. There was no ceremony for her, no goodbye, just steps to follow, and then it was over. Ibn Fadlan's account became one of the most detailed outside descriptions of Viking life. Not from a saga, not from legend, but from someone who was there. He saw it. He wrote it. And now, we know it happened. The graves confirmed the violence or the layout and the method or the items. All of it matched. The more we dig up, the more we see that he wasn't lying. This type of funeral wasn't used for every Viking, but it happened often enough to leave a record. The fact that it was so structured tells us how accepted it was. People played their roles. The men, the angel of death, the girl, even the animals. Everyone had a place. Nothing was chaotic. It was all planned, step by step. I still can't decide what's more shocking, the act itself or how coldly it was carried out. There were no outbursts, no protests. The tribe saw it as their duty. The fire burned, the ship drifted, and when it was done, everyone went home. They had honoured their leader, they had followed the old ways, that was enough. The story makes it clear that in Viking culture, power didn't end with death, it followed into the afterlife. The funeral was proof of that, and the girl, though silent, became part of that power. Her death was not recorded in her name, only as part of someone else's journey. It's strangely absurd that they treated it like a sacred act while turning it into a public execution. Next, we'll see how the Vikings used the same logic not just for the dead, but for the living, where sex wasn't just part of a farewell, it became a weapon. That ritual wasn't the exception. It was a glimpse into how Vikings thought about power, and sex, for them, wasn't just a private matter, it was woven into everything. They used it to control, to punish, to reward, and to reinforce their place in the world, whether through public rituals, battlefield humiliation, or legal consequences. Intimacy wasn't really intimate. It was about dominance. It was about structure. It was about staying in control. There were specific words in the Viking world that could destroy a man's life. One of the worst was rega. That word didn't just mean weak. It meant being passive during sex. And being passive meant losing respect. If someone called you that in public, you had the legal right to kill them. No questions asked. You could stab a man in the street and walk away because nothing damaged a Viking man more than being labelled sexually submissive. Another word was og, which carried a similar meaning. These weren't insults that could be laughed off. They were serious accusations. If they stuck, your entire life could fall apart. You might lose your right to carry weapons. You might not be allowed to speak in court. In some places, you could lose your land. It didn't matter how many battles you had fought. If people believed you were sexually weak, your place in society vanished. It's strange how the legal system focuses more on rumours about bedroom roles than whether someone stole a goat or burned down a hut. That shows how deep the fear of weakness ran. People didn't just want to win in war, they wanted to dominate in every setting, including the most personal one. And if you failed to meet those expectations, people didn't forget. These ideas weren't hidden. They were written into laws. The Icelandic law code spelled out the consequences. If you were accused of being unmanly and didn't respond, the accusation became fact. You were expected to fight, sometimes to the death. Honour had to be restored. Silence wasn't an option. A Viking man had to be hard in speech, hard in war, and hard in bed. This pressure was everywhere. Sagas are filled with feuds that began because someone questioned another man's masculinity. Not his fighting skill, not his leadership, but his role in private acts. Some of these feuds lasted for years. Dozens of people died just because one man called another too soft. Wives used it too. A woman could ruin her husband with a single comment in front of the right people. Compared to how people argue today over who forgot to text back, Viking masculinity was a full-time job with no days off. It never ended. Even a husband and wife weren't equals in this system. If a man showed too much tenderness, his wife could mock him. If he didn't perform well enough, she could leave him. She might even take his property with her. Viking women had that right if they were freeborn. This structure created constant tension. Men had to prove their dominance all the time, in fights, in drinking halls, in marriage beds. And if someone lost that dominance, even once, others noticed. Stories travelled fast, reputation crumbled, and once it did, it was almost impossible to rebuild. Because in this world, being marked as passive meant being treated as less than a man. That's why sexual violence became a method of psychological warfare. When Vikings captured enemies, especially leaders, they didn't always kill them. Sometimes they humiliated them instead. One method was called the shame stroke. It involved stabbing or cutting a man's buttocks after defeat. The act symbolized penetration, turning the victim into a figure of mockery. There are sagas where entire groups chased a man across the sea because he had once insulted them in that way. Killing him wasn't enough. He had to be broken. Viking society didn't just fear weakness, it punished it. The idea was simple. If you take away someone's ability to dominate, you take away their identity, and that extended into every part of life. I still think the scariest part isn't how violent it was, but how logical it all seemed to them. There was a system, a hierarchy, a list of rules. They believed in it so fully that people followed it without hesitation, even when it led to death, even when it broke families, even when it made life unbearable. This structure also applied to slaves. Free women had some protections, though limited, but slave women had none. Viking law stated clearly that using a slave for sex wasn't a crime. It might be a property offence at best. If a slave resisted, she could be beaten, if she were killed in the process. The punishment was usually a small fine. Her body was worth no more than a broken tool. And so, sex was not an expression of love or comfort. It was a chart of control. Men used it to climb higher. Women used it to defend their status or destroy their rivals. Enemies used it to cause lasting damage. Everyone knew their place, and that place was constantly under threat. You could lose it in one night, in one word, in one failed act. These weren't accidents. They were choices. The Viking world wasn't chaotic. It had rules, harsh, cold, clear rules, and sex wasn't outside those rules. It was built into them. It was part of the system. It's almost ridiculous that people treated power like a bedroom contract with blood clauses. Next, we'll look at what happened when Vikings used sex not just as punishment or insult, but as part of public law and ritual, where even weddings were staged events with witnesses, sheets, and consequences. The same rules that turned sex into a weapon also shaped how Vikings thought about marriage. It wasn't a private moment between two people. It was a public matter with legal consequences, family involvement, and community oversight. The wedding itself was only the beginning. What really mattered came after. The first night, the first act, the proof that the marriage was complete. For a Viking wedding to be valid, the couple had to have sex. That wasn't assumed. It had to be seen, heard, or confirmed. In many cases, both families provided witnesses, not to sit in the room but to stand nearby and listen. Sometimes a trusted family member would remain in the room to watch. If no one could verify that the marriage had been consummated, it could be declared invalid. That meant the dowry could be returned. That meant land and property agreements could be cancelled. The couple had responsibilities. The bride was expected to show proof of virginity. This often meant blood on the bedsheets. The groom was expected to perform without failure. If he couldn't, the bride's family could accuse him of dishonouring the agreement. There were laws written with penalties for both sides. If the bride was not a virgin and had hidden it, her family could be sued. If the groom failed to consummate the marriage, he might have to pay compensation. It's almost hilarious that a wedding night could turn into a courtroom, with sheets as evidence and relatives as witnesses. Nothing about it was romantic. The act itself was treated like a legal transaction, and that wasn't by accident. Marriage in Viking society was about land, bloodlines, and alliances. Emotions came last. Agreements came first. Symbols played a major role. During the ceremony, a priest would place Thor's hammer on the bride's lap. It wasn't just for show. Everyone knew it represented fertility. The hammer stood for male power. The lap represented the womb. The ritual was simple and clear. After that, the bride would wear a crown made of metal or flowers. It wasn't just decoration. Removing the crown later, usually by the groom, symbolised that she was no longer a maiden. The couple was then led to the bed by both families. The bed itself was often decorated with herbs and oils thought to bring luck and children. A priest or elder would say a blessing. It usually mentions fertility directly. Some even included graphic references, spoken out loud with serious faces. This wasn't done in secret. It was part of the script. It was expected. Compared to today's wedding speeches and awkward dancing, this looks like a fertility ritual mixed with a notary appointment. Everyone played a part. No one acted embarrassed. The process was old and known. The focus was not on how the couple felt, but on whether they followed the correct steps. Marriage was a contract. The sexual act was its seal. The morning after came with its own duties. The bedsheets were examined. If they showed blood, they might be kept as proof. In some families, they were stored in case a legal dispute happened later. If there was no blood, people asked questions. If there was a problem, a formal complaint could be filed. This could lead to a second ceremony or even a complete annulment. That kind of pressure wasn't unique. In many Viking sagas, men brag about their ability to satisfy their wives. Women talk about what they expect in return. A man who failed to do his part could lose face. A woman who refused could face suspicion. Both had roles, and those roles were clear. I find it troubling that what should have been a personal moment became something the whole village had an opinion on. But that was how the Vikings lived. Privacy didn't have much room in their culture. What you did in bed could follow you to court. It could affect your inheritance. It could decide your social standing. Expectation extended beyond the couple. The community needed to see that the marriage was real. It wasn't about love. It was about continuity. A family alliance meant little if there were no children, and children only came if the marriage started the right way. That belief turned the wedding night into a kind of test, one that had to be passed immediately and without excuses. This was especially true for high-status families. Kings, jarls, and wealthy landowners all faced more scrutiny. Their marriages involved property, politics, and public image. If something went wrong on the first night, it could lead to conflict between clans. That made the rituals even more detailed, even more watched. The pressure didn't only fall on the men. Brides were expected to be pure. Their bodies were treated like part of the dowry. Virginity wasn't just a virtue. It was proof of value. If that proof wasn't delivered, the bride's worth could be questioned, and that worth wasn't just personal. It reflected on her entire family. Sometimes, the rituals took strange turns. In one saga, the bride's uncle stayed in the room to make sure the groom did his job. That wasn't seen as strange. It was seen as practical. In other stories, midwives were involved in the morning after, collecting and inspecting the sheets. The details may vary, but the goal was always the same: proof. Viking marriage was a transaction. That doesn't mean there was no affection, but affection didn't protect you from the rules. The ritual had to be performed, the proof had to be given, the families had to be satisfied. Only then did the marriage count. Only then could the couple move on. It's honestly bizarre how something so personal became an event with paperwork, witnesses, and physical evidence. Next, we'll explore how the same logic applies to sex as punishment. Losing in battle didn't just mean wounds, but permanent shame. Once the wedding was complete and the proof was accepted, the couple's place in society was more secure. But that didn't mean personal reputation was safe. In Viking society, respect didn't come from age or money alone. It came from how others saw you. And a few things mattered more than your sexual role. Not who you loved, not how often, but how was your role understood by others? The Vikings had no patience for men who didn't meet the expectations of dominance. They had words for those who failed. Raga and Vega were the most serious. These terms didn't just mean weak, they meant sexually passive. If someone called you that, it wasn't a joke. It was a direct attack on your honor, and the law made it clear you had the right to kill someone for saying it. This wasn't just about pride, it was built into the legal structure. The accusation alone, if left unanswered, could stain a man's reputation permanently. He would be seen as unfit to lead, to fight, or even to speak in legal matters. He could lose his right to inherit. His voice would be dismissed. His property could be questioned, all because of what someone claimed he did behind closed doors. It's absurd how one word could turn a warrior into a nobody, all because of a rumor about who did what in bed. But that was how the system worked. The sexual role wasn't private, it was social. The man who took control kept his status. The one who didn't was seen as less than a man. That idea wasn't challenged. It was accepted by nearly everyone. The sagas are full of examples. Conflicts that started because one man questioned another's masculinity. Arguments in drinking halls turned deadly after just a few words. Entire families were pulled into feuds that lasted for years. People died. Homes were burned. Alliances broke down. All because someone insulted another man's place in the sexual hierarchy. The fear of being labelled passive made men act with constant aggression. They had to prove their strength in every setting, on the battlefield, in court, at home, even in casual conversation. If someone made a remark, you had to respond. If you stayed quiet, people assumed it was true. Silence was treated as agreement. Compared to modern standards, where people argue over opinions online, Viking insults could legally justify murder. That created a culture where men were always alert, always ready to fight, not just to defend their land, but to defend their name. The threat wasn't just physical, it was social, and that made it even more powerful. The consequences went beyond personal reputation. A man who lost his honour could no longer serve as a witness. He couldn't make contracts. His word carried no weight. Even if he was wealthy or skilled, the label stayed with him. It followed him everywhere. He might still live in the community, but he would be ignored. In many ways, he became invisible. That fear shaped daily life. Boys were raised with warnings. Don't act weak. Don't let anyone call you soft. Don't give others a reason to doubt you. The message was clear. Strength was everything. But strength didn't just mean swinging a sword. It meant controlling how others saw you. Every word, every act, every reaction was measured. Sometimes, the accusations were used as weapons. In a feud, calling someone Raga could be more effective than a spear. It would force the accused to fight back. If he didn't, the shame would grow. If he did, the situation escalated. Either way, the one who made the insult gained power. That made these words dangerous. Not just personally, but politically. I still find it shocking that legal documents had to include guidelines for what to do when someone called you sexually passive. But they did. The laws spelled it out clearly. How to respond. How much time did you had? What were the penalties if you didn't act? It was all written down like a manual for how to protect your masculinity. The burden wasn't just on the accused. The one who made the claim had to be careful. If you called someone Raga and couldn't prove it, you could be punished just as harshly. In some cases, Making a false accusation was treated like slander or even murder. That meant these words carried weight on both sides. They weren't thrown around lightly. This dynamic also influenced how people behaved socially. Men avoided anything that might make them seem soft. That included clothing, gestures, or even certain hobbies. They had to maintain an image, one that matched the expectations of dominance and control. That image became a kind of armor, and anyone who cracked it risked losing everything. The obsession with roles didn't lead to security, it led to anxiety. People lived in fear of being labelled, of being watched, of being judged for things that might not even be true. It didn't matter what actually happened. What mattered was what people believed. That belief became law. The Vikings didn't have privacy in the way we understand it. Personal acts were part of public life. Your behaviour, your speech, your role in sex, all became tools for others to measure you. And if they didn't like what they saw, they had legal means to tear you down. It's almost comical how a culture so focused on toughness ended up making everyone afraid of a few syllables. Next, we'll look at how this fear of submission fed into a wider system of humiliation, where even in defeat, a man could be shamed so deeply that death felt like mercy. Everything in Viking society came down to who had power. But unlike many other cultures, power wasn't just about land, money, or family name. It was about the role. Specifically, your role in bed. There was a line drawn sharply between those who took and those who received. The man who took control, the one who initiated and dominated, was seen as honourable. The one who did not, the one in the so-called passive role, was seen as weak. And weakness wasn't just mocked, it was punished. This division wasn't based on preference or identity. It was legal, it was structural. If a man was known or even rumoured to be passive, he lost more than dignity, he lost rights. In some parts of Scandinavia, a man with that reputation could no longer carry weapons. That meant he was no longer considered a warrior. He couldn't fight for his tribe. He couldn't protect his land. His sword was taken, both literally and symbolically. He also lost his voice in court. His testimony no longer counted. It didn't matter how honest he was or how much he had seen. A man labelled passive was treated like a liar. He could no longer make contracts. He could not act as a witness. In the eyes of the law, he was damaged beyond repair, and that loss of credibility affected every part of his life. It's almost impressive how quickly a single rumour could reduce a man from citizen to ghost, because once the label stuck, recovery was nearly impossible. Viking society was not built to offer second chances. A man might rebuild his home, he might earn back wealth, but he could never erase what others believed about his status. Inheritance was another wall he would hit. A passive man might be denied his share of land or family goods even if he was the eldest son, even if his name was on the property. Other relatives could challenge the inheritance, and the courts, seeing his damaged reputation, often sided against him. That meant losing not just honour but survival. Land meant food. Land meant place. Without it, a man drifted on the edge of society. That structure didn't happen by accident. It was reinforced through law, story, and expectation. Boys were raised to believe that anything soft was dangerous, that letting go of control, even once, meant letting go of manhood, and so they trained not just in weapons and skills, but in the performance of masculinity. They watched their fathers, they copied their brothers, they learned early what was acceptable and what was fatal. Compared to today's debates about identity and gender, Viking views were like a courtroom where you only got one sentence. You either met the standard or you did not, and if you failed, no one waited to understand why. The system wasn't designed to ask questions, it was designed to assign status. This kind of thinking created strict categories. Men who held power didn't just dominate in bed, they also dominated in meetings, in decisions, in public events. Their sexual dominance mirrored their social rank. And that was no coincidence. The connection between sex and power was intentional. It kept the hierarchy in place. Even gods weren't safe from this system. In the sagas, gods who crossed lines were mocked. Loki, who shifted forms and sometimes took on female roles, was often laughed at. Odin, who practiced certain types of magic associated with women, was sometimes criticized by other gods. These stories weren't told for entertainment. They were told to remind people what happened when power was questioned. The link between sexual position and public status also showed up in punishments. If a man was defeated in battle and sexually humiliated, his life afterward was marked. He couldn't return home with pride. His body carried the symbol of defeat. His tribe might turn him away. His name might never be spoken again. That wasn't just punishment. It was removal. He didn't die, but he was erased. I think the cruelest part is that no one had to touch you to take everything from you. They just had to believe something happened, and that belief worked like fact. It spread. It stuck. It changed how people treated you. You might walk the same roads. You might eat the same meals, but you were no longer seen the same way. This system didn't allow for flexibility. There were no neutral roles. There was no room for compromise. You were either in control or you were controlled. The idea of equals in bed didn't exist. That would have broken the logic. And Viking society didn't tolerate broken logic. Every structure had to support the same idea. That power flowed in one direction. This rigidity made society predictable, but also brittle. It meant strength had to be constantly proven, and it meant that even powerful men lived with fear. Fear of failure, fear of rumour, fear of a challenge they might not survive. In public, they laughed and boasted, but in private, the system never let them rest. It's quietly absurd how much pressure they built around something that most people today see as private. Next, we'll examine how this hierarchy didn't just live in rules and reputations. It showed up in battlefields and scars, where sexual conquest became a method of breaking enemies without killing them. In Viking society, masculinity was not something you simply had. It was something you performed, constantly, in front of others. A man's worth wasn't judged by what he claimed, but by what others believed about him. And when it came to sexuality, even the smallest hint of weakness could destroy everything. It didn't take an act. It didn't take proof. A single rumour was enough to bring down a warrior, a chieftain, or a household name. The terms Vega and Rhaegar weren't just casual insults. They were accusations that went to the heart of a man's identity. To be labelled passive in a sexual encounter was to be marked as lesser, as submissive, as something other than a real man. These weren't private concerns. They were public condemnations. And in many cases, they were punishable by death. Not the death of the accused, but the death of the accuser, because Viking law allowed a man to kill anyone who hurled these words at him, and often he would walk away without consequence. It's strange to think that one word about your bedroom could do more damage than a sword to the chest. In a culture that valued strength, bravery, and dominance, losing your reputation as a masculine figure was like losing your sword, your shield, and your ship all at once. Men lived with this fear hanging over them every day. They had to speak loudly, fight fiercely, and flirt boldly, not just for fun, but to prove they were still men. Because if they didn't, someone else might start whispering. It wasn't only about what you did, it was about how people interpreted what you did. If you avoided a fight, you could be called a coward. If you refused a drink, you might be seen as weak. If you showed too much affection to another man, even as a friend, some might say you were soft. There was no safety, no line you could stand behind. Everything was a test. This pressure created a cycle of overcompensation. Men pushed each other harder, drank more than they wanted, fought when they didn't need to, and constantly exaggerated their stories. Bragging became a shield. Boasting wasn't just allowed, it was expected. If you weren't loud about your conquests, people would assume you had none, and then the rumours might begin. Young men had it the worst. They hadn't yet earned battle scars or stories. They were watched closely, measured by every action, weighed by every silence. If they were too quiet, people would talk. If they were too emotional, they might be labelled soft. So many tried to act older, meaner, louder than they really were. They mimicked the chieftains and the berserkers, hoping the noise would protect them. Compared to today, where masculinity is debated in think pieces and podcasts, Viking masculinity was brutally simple and terrifyingly rigid. It's hard to overstate how deeply this system shaped their lives. Masculinity wasn't one aspect of identity, it was the whole thing. A man without it had no place. He could not join raids, speak in assemblies, inherit land, or represent his family. He became invisible. Worse than invisible, he became a shame to those around him. That's why so many sagas include duels that begin with insults. One man calls another Raga, and the next day, one of them is dead. These weren't petty arguments. These were legal and cultural battles over identity, and if you didn't fight, you proved the insult true. So the fight wasn't a choice, it was a duty. There's something especially cruel about how little evidence was needed. You didn't have to be caught in the act. You didn't need a witness. Just a whisper was enough. And even if you defended yourself successfully, the stain might linger. People would remember. They'd tell the story again, with new twists. The gossip would grow teeth. A lie could live longer than the man it hurt. I can't help but feel sorry for the quieter ones, the thinkers, the hesitant boys who never stood a chance. And it wasn't just about shame. Losing your masculine status could bring real legal consequences. You could be barred from trials, denied weapons, shut out from inheritance. Your voice, your money, your rights, all gone. And because these losses weren't officially recorded, they didn't come with warning. One day you were part of the community. The next, you were a ghost. Men who sensed their reputations slipping often tried desperate things. Some started fights in taverns. Others courted women aggressively in public. Some insulted others just to shift the spotlight. The more a man feared being seen as weak, the more violent he might become. And Viking society rewarded that violence. It saw it as proof of strength. There are stories of men who killed their own kin because of rumours. Others burned down homes, forced confessions, even bribed witnesses. All to protect a reputation that could vanish in a single conversation. What made it worse was that there was no way to earn it back once it was lost. You couldn't undo the suspicion. You could only try to silence it. The most tragic cases were the ones where the accused had done nothing wrong. Maybe they were simply quiet, or kind, or uninterested in proving anything. That alone was dangerous. In a world built on dominance, being still could be seen as surrender. And surrender had no place in Viking masculinity. This extreme system of gender control helped Viking leaders maintain order. It gave men something to fear and something to chase. But it also made every day feel like a battlefield. The fight wasn't just in the fjords or the forests. It was in every room, every hall, every feast. It was in how you walked, how you laughed, how you looked at others. Masculinity became a cage with iron bars made of silence and stares, and every man carried the key, but only for others. Never for himself. Next, we'll leave the men behind for a moment and look at what Viking women were expected to be, and how some of them refused to play by the rules. The next time you hear someone say that words can't hurt, remember the Viking age. In that world, a single word could break a man's future, shame his family, and start a feud that would last generations, especially if that word questioned his masculinity. These were not just personal slights, they were triggers for bloodshed, and many of the Icelandic sagas were built around such moments, when one man looked another in the eye and called him weak, passive, or unmanly. The insult didn't need to be shouted, it didn't even need to be repeated. Just once was enough. Once, in the wrong hall, in the wrong tone, in front of the bad people, and the damage was done. The man on the receiving end had only two options. Either he proved the insult false with violence, or he lived with it forever. And in Viking society, living with it meant losing everything. It's no surprise that so many feuds began this way. A quiet gathering, a few cups of ale. And then, from across the table, someone mentioned a rumour. Maybe it was about a failed seduction. Maybe about the man's voice, or his posture, or something more explicit. And suddenly the room grew still. Everyone waited. Would he stand? Would he fight if he did? It proved nothing. If he didn't, it proved everything. It's a bit like modern internet culture, where one comment can ruin your whole week, except back then, it might destroy your entire bloodline. What followed these insults could vary. In some cases, it was a quick fight, a broken table, a cut cheek. But often, it went further. Families got involved, brothers picked sides, weapons were sharpened, and someone died. Then someone else, then another. Before long, it became a feud, a pattern of revenge that spiraled far beyond the original insult. The sagas describe these events with grim clarity. A man is accused of being Raga. He challenges the accuser. They fight. One dies. His kin vow revenge. More fighting. Homes burned, livestock stolen. Sometimes entire farms are wiped out. And at the heart of it all was that single moment when a man's honour was put on trial and the only judge was violence. This wasn't just about wounded pride, it was about social survival. If a man accepted the insult, others would begin to treat him differently. He might be excluded from raids, passed over in assemblies, or denied marriage alliances. People might laugh behind his back, or worse, pity him. In Viking culture, pity could cut deeper than steel. It's hard not to feel a strange kind of respect for how much power they gave to a single word, and how quickly that word could tear apart a village. Some of the most famous Viking feuds began with nothing more than suspicion. A man walks into a hall, and someone mentions his long hair, his soft hands, or his close friendship with another man. That's all it takes. The accused feels the pressure of every eye. He knows what they're thinking. He also knows that if he doesn't act now, the rumours will grow. So he acts, he fights, and maybe he kills. But even then, the gossip might not stop. There were no courts for these matters, no official hearings, just a code of honour enforced by fists and axes. Even the laws of the time, while strict about property and inheritances, were vague when it came to insults. But they were clear about one thing. If someone insulted your masculinity and you killed him on the spot, it might be forgiven. Not always, but often. Especially if the community understood the weight of what had been said. I sometimes wonder how many men were buried not because of who they were, but because someone else said something they couldn't ignore. In some cases, the accusations were planned. A rival might use the insult to provoke a fight he wanted, or to ruin a man standing without ever lifting a blade. It was a weapon as effective as any spear, and harder to trace. A well-timed insult could shift the balance of power in a village or even a clan. Viking poets and storytellers understood this well. They built entire epics around these moments, not because the insult itself was dramatic, but because of what it represented. A challenge to manhood, a threat to reputation, a spark that could light years of conflict, and the audience knew it too. They didn't laugh at the insult. They held their breath, waiting to see what the insulted man would do, and often he did what he had to, not because he wanted to fight, but because he had no choice. The moment someone questioned his masculinity, the clock started ticking. Every second that passed without a response made the insult stronger. So he fought, or he hunted the accuser down later, or he tried to reclaim his honour in some other way. But it was always too late to walk away clean. The weight of these expectations fell on every man, even the elders, even the warriors, even the kings. No one was above it. Masculinity was not a permanent title. It had to be defended constantly, and one wrong word could take it all away. That's why Viking men guarded their image so fiercely. They spoke carefully, acted boldly, and punished insults swiftly, not just for themselves, but for their families, their clans, their gods. Reputation was not a private thing. It was a shield that covered everyone close to you, and once it cracked, it could not be repaired. Strangely, it makes our modern dramas about social media look like very polite tea parties. There's something deeply unsettling about how fragile their system was, how easily violence could erupt. There was little room for forgiveness or misunderstanding, but it was the world they lived in, a world where your worth could be measured by a single word, and your future decided by your response to it. Next, we'll turn from men to women and examine what happened when Viking women rejected their expected roles and challenged the system from within. If Viking men lived under constant pressure to prove their masculinity, Viking women were far from passive in that dynamic. They were not silent victims or delicate ornaments waiting to be claimed. They understood the power they held, and sometimes they wielded it with surgical precision. In a world that valued sexual dominance and strength, a woman could destroy a man's honor without raising a sword. All she had to do was speak. There were cases recorded in saga after saga of women publicly accusing their husbands of weakness in bed. The accusation alone could crack a man's standing in the community. If she said he was soft, hesitant, or worse, passive, others listened, and when others heard, they judged. The same code that demanded men respond violently to insults gave women the leverage to humiliate or even end a man's influence. It wasn't just gossip. It was a blow to his right to exist as a man among men. Sometimes it was personal. A wife frustrated with a marriage could turn that frustration into a campaign. She might start small, a joke at a feast, a remark to a friend. But once she said the words, she knew exactly where they would go. And if the husband failed to respond with strength, the narrative took on a life of its own. His peers would talk, his rivals would whisper, and his value, as both a man and a leader, would drop. It's a bit like when someone posts a sarcastic breakup rant online today, and your reputation dies in the comments. Viking women weren't doing this solely out of spite. They had rights, more than most women in medieval Europe. A wife had the legal ability to initiate divorce, and sexual performance was a valid reason. If she claimed that her husband had failed to satisfy her or was too timid in the bedroom, the court would listen. No need for evidence beyond her word. Her voice carried weight, not because the system favoured women, but because sex was so tightly linked to honour. That legal weight gave women real power. A dissatisfied wife could not only end a marriage but also leave a mark on her ex-husband's reputation that might never fade. In some cases, the man found it difficult to remarry. Others were mocked or challenged by younger men who now saw them as weak. The fallout could last years. Sometimes it led to revenge. Other times, the man simply left the village, choosing exile over shame. One famous case tells of a woman who, after leaving her husband, stood in public and detailed his failures with cruel precision. She mimicked his movements. She mocked his words. The crowd laughed, but the husband, unable to counter the claims without exposing even more, remained silent. From that day forward, no one saw him the same way. He was a warrior once, but after that day, he was a joke. I can't decide what's more brutal, Viking axe fights or Viking pillow talk. Not all women use this power destructively. Some invoked it to escape abusive or unwanted marriages. The law provided them with a way out, and they took it. Others may have used it to shift family alliances, gain favour, or protect their children's futures. In any case, the ability to use sexual dissatisfaction as legal ammunition made Viking women uniquely empowered compared to their European counterparts. It also meant that men had to be cautious. They couldn't just rely on strength in battle or loud words in the hall. They had to satisfy expectations at home too. If they failed there, even the strongest war chief could find himself vulnerable. There was no private life, not really. A man's worth was always under review, and his wife was his closest judge. Some may argue that this power created a balance. The man could end a feud with an axe, but the woman could end his social life with a sentence. Neither side had complete control, and both knew that their roles in the household were tied to community judgment. Reputation was a shared burden. It reminds me how in modern relationships, one angry podcast episode can do the work of a dozen lawyers. The ability for women to speak openly about such matters reflected a cultural comfort with sex that often surprises modern readers. The Viking world was not shy, nor was it obsessed with modesty in the way later Christian Europe would become. Sexual activity, especially within marriage, was seen as part of life. A man who fails in bed often fails in life. A woman who complained was not seen as immoral. She was seen as honest. This openness extended into rituals and public events. Wedding feasts often included jokes about fertility and strength. Symbols like Thor's hammer were placed in the bride's lap to bless the marriage. The wedding night itself might involve family members escorting the couple to their bed. In some areas, it was customary for female relatives to undress the bride and inspect the sheets the next morning. Privacy was limited. Expectations were clear, so when a woman spoke out, she wasn't breaking a taboo. She was acting within her rights, and that made her statements all the more powerful. She didn't need to scream or cry. Just a few clear words, repeated in the right setting, could devastate a man's future. And everyone around them would nod, because they knew the rules. They knew that in a society where honour was everything, being called inadequate meant losing everything. Of course, not every accusation was fair. Some women may have lied or exaggerated. Others may have used the system to punish men for unrelated grievances. But that's true of any legal right. The fact remains that Viking women had a tool many others didn't, and they weren't afraid to use it. There's something strangely modern about it, isn't there? That someone could lose social status because of what happened under a blanket. For Viking men, this was the other battlefield. One, they couldn't fight with steel. One where silence could be deadly, and the wrong partner could be your undoing. For Viking women, it was an edge, a rare moment where they controlled the story, and the story had consequences. As we continue, we'll look deeper into how these sexual roles shaped legal traditions, and how the idea of masculinity and dominance was written directly into Viking law codes. After seeing how Viking women could use public accusation to destroy a man's honour, it's essential to look at how Viking men themselves were trapped in another cycle. It wasn't just about strength, it was about being seen as dominant at all times, and in the Viking world, dominance often meant aggression. This was not something that stopped in battle. It followed men into their homes, their beds, and even their private reputations. A man who didn't assert himself constantly was at risk, not just of being laughed at, but of being stripped of his social rights. The pressure to perform sexually was not about pleasure or intimacy. It was about power. A man had to be seen as the initiator, the aggressor, the one who took what he wanted. If he showed gentleness, hesitation, or affection that looked too tender, people started talking. He might be called soft, or worse, submissive. And once that word was attached to him, it spread like smoke. Neighbours would whisper. Family members might distance themselves. Rivals would seize the opportunity. This fear of appearing weak led to a loop. To prove strength, many men turned to violence, and not just in public, in private too. Sexual aggression became a tool, something that reinforced their place in the hierarchy. A violent man was a man in control, or so they believed. The rougher the act, the more it proved that he wasn't passive. And if the woman suffered in silence or stayed quiet, the system kept working. It's like when someone yells in a meeting just to sound like they're the boss, even if no one asked their opinion. These performances of dominance didn't happen by accident. They were reinforced by expectations passed down through families, sagas, and traditions. Boys grew up learning that to be respected, They needed to be feared not just on the battlefield, but in their household. If a husband were too kind, his wife might speak out. If he were too soft, others might make assumptions. And so the pressure to dominate became a kind of armour. It protected them from being labelled as weak, but it also trapped them in roles they couldn't escape. Sexual violence, in that context, wasn't always driven by lust. It was often strategic, a way to assert class, gender, or age superiority. A master over a servant, a warrior over a captive, a husband over a wife. These actions maintained the structure. They reminded everyone of their place, and those at the bottom knew they had little power to fight back, because if they did, they would be accused of disrespecting a superior, and that, too, could bring punishment. This might be one of the few societies where failure to intimidate could literally cost you your legal identity. The irony is that this constant demand for masculine control made many Viking men deeply insecure. Their identities were fragile. One insult could bring everything down. One accusation could ruin them. So they doubled down. More aggression, more control, more fear, and the cycle continued. The more they feared being seen as weak, the more forcefully they acted, and each act of violence became both a shield and a message. I am not passive. I am not less. I am still a man. This didn't just affect individuals. It shaped the culture. Communities became places where showing emotional vulnerability could be dangerous, where the worst thing someone could say wasn't that you lied, but that you submitted. Submission, in Viking law and custom, equated to social death. And because sex was tied so closely to social status, even the bedroom became a battleground. It reminds me of how some people today think admitting to therapy is a weakness, when really it's just human. Some men probably resented this system. They might have wanted different relationships, gentler ones, more equal ones, but the risk was too high. To be seen loving too much, caring too deeply, or hesitating even once could draw suspicion. And in a society where being labelled unmanly could result in exile or worse, few were willing to test the limits. Viking laws even protected this cycle. While some accusations could be taken to court, many weren't. If a man were violent toward his wife but claimed she had questioned his manhood, he might be excused. After all, he was only defending his honour, and honour, in the Viking world, was sacred. It was a man's armour. Lose that, and you lose everything. This fear-based structure bred paranoia. Men watched each other constantly. They joked in ways that were half warnings. They tested each other's reactions. And if someone failed to respond with the right amount of force or swagger, it was noted. That man might find himself challenged in public, insulted in private, or avoided altogether. He was no longer safe. I've always found it sad that so many Viking men lived like they were in a constant audition for manhood. In this environment, it's no surprise that violence became normalised, not just on the battlefield, but in homes, in ceremonies, and in sex. Young boys learned early what was expected, and if they didn't learn fast enough, someone made sure they did. The violence wasn't random. It was taught, justified, and even celebrated, because in their minds, it protected them from being degraded. Of course, there were exceptions. There were probably quiet couples who loved each other gently, communities where these extremes were less visible. But the fact that sagas, laws, and oral traditions all echoed the same message tells us that the pattern was real, the threat was real, and the fear of being seen as passive shaped lives more than any sword or axe ever did. This cycle of sexual aggression didn't create strong men, it created scared ones. Men are too afraid to be vulnerable, too afraid to lose their place, too afraid to stop hurting others, because hurting others was how they survived. In the next part, we'll explore how this obsession with dominance carried into public rituals, and how even funerals reflected a deep fear of losing masculine control in death. The Viking obsession with dominance did not stop at defending personal masculinity or controlling women. It extended into the battlefield and political sphere, but not in the way you might expect. While some cultures celebrated victory with banners and trophies, Viking raiders sometimes used the bodies of their defeated enemies as a message, not just with swords or axes, but with acts of sexual symbolism meant to humiliate and destroy a man standing even after death. In Viking ideology, the worst thing that could happen to a man was to lose his masculine power. So what better way to obliterate a rival than to attack exactly that? One of the most brutal and symbolic forms of this was the act of male-on-male domination, not as a result of desire, but purely to shame. In Viking society, it wasn't the act itself that mattered most. It was the role. To be on the receiving end meant to be conquered, dishonoured, stripped of manhood. The implication was clear. You had failed to defend your dignity. You were no longer a real man. Sometimes this was done literally, but in many cases, just the threat or accusation could destroy a man's place in society. It's like if someone could ruin your entire career today just by starting a rumour that you always ask for decaf. This symbolic act of sexual conquest was especially present during public punishments or after major defeats. Some sagas describe enemies being subdued, then violated not for pleasure, but for spectacle. In certain cases, the act didn't even need to happen. A gesture was enough. A thrust of a weapon into the rear, a public jest about what had been done, a drawing carved into wood. These were not random cruelties. They were calculated strikes meant to collapse a man's honour from within. Some raiders even used these tactics when sacking villages, while killing an enemy might remove a threat. Humiliating him destroyed the lineage. If a leader were known to have been dominated, his sons might never rise to power. His brothers might be ashamed to defend him. His followers could abandon his cause. The attack went deeper than the flesh. It rewrote how others saw him, how his story would be told, and whether his bloodline deserved to continue. This shows how, in Viking culture, masculinity was not just an individual trait, it was an inherited currency. The act of anal violation, either real or symbolic, was not viewed as sexual in a conventional way. In fact, it was framed as the opposite. For the Vikings, it had nothing to do with pleasure and everything to do with status. Just like a slave could be stripped of clothing to indicate ownership, a man stripped of sexual dominance was publicly rebranded as inferior. This was sometimes done in war, but also in revenge killings or long-standing blood feuds. It was a tool as powerful as a sword, but far more insidious. There are accounts from medieval chroniclers, especially outsiders who observed Viking behaviour, that describe this with a mix of horror and fascination. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who travelled among the Rus, a Viking-descended group, detailed practices and beliefs that place sexual dominance at the centre of public rituals. Even if the acts weren't carried out in his presence, the stories circulated widely. They were known, feared, and accepted as a terrifying part of Viking warfare. The power of this form of humiliation lay in its permanence. A man could recover from a wound. He could even win back a lost battle. But once his name was attached to the image of sexual submission, there was no way back. He became the target of jokes, whispers, and social death. Even if he denied it, people would always remember, and memory was everything. In a culture that passed history through saga and poem, your reputation was your legacy. Sometimes I wonder if the Viking sagas had a gossip column buried somewhere in the verses. The logic behind these acts was disturbingly consistent. In Viking law and custom, a man had the right to kill someone who accused him of being passive. But if that accusation was proven or widely believed, the law often sided with the dominant figure. That meant the one accused could lose not only his rights but his protection. It was a high-stakes game, where words became weapons and gestures cut deeper than blades. There were even ceremonial ways of declaring this kind of dominance. At times, defeated enemies were posed in suggestive ways after death. Their bodies were displayed in positions that mimicked submission. In some cases, effigies or sculptures were left behind to mock them. These acts weren't just cruelty, they were public announcements, a statement that this man had been stripped, shamed, and removed from the ranks of true warriors. For surviving members of a defeated family or clan, this kind of legacy was devastating. It made revenge harder, it damaged alliances, and it forced many to live with the shadow of a relative who had failed in the worst way. Not in battle, but in bed. Or so the story went. Viking masculinity was not about emotion, courage, or wisdom. It was about power. Visible, aggressive, undeniable power. Once that was gone, everything else followed. Compared to that, modern insults about someone's social media profile seem almost friendly. Looking back, it's clear that the Vikings used sexuality as more than a private act. It was a language, a weapon, a public statement, just like plundering a monastery or burning a rival's house. Symbolically violating a man sent a message. It meant, I defeated you so completely that I own your story now. And in the Viking worldview, that was the ultimate form of control. Today, we often think of war as physical and strategy-based. But for the Vikings, psychological warfare played just as large a role. If they could make people fear humiliation more than death, then they had already won before the axe fell. That's why even today, these stories feel disturbing. They reveal a society where sexuality and violence walked hand in hand, and where public shame was more lasting than any scar. What shocks me most is how planned it all was. They didn't stumble into cruelty, they rehearsed it. As we go deeper into these practices, we'll see how these rules didn't just apply to men. Viking women, too, had a place in this brutal hierarchy, and sometimes they learned to use it to their advantage. In the next part, we'll look at how female sexuality became both a shield and a sword in a world ruled by force. In Viking society, losing a battle was not the worst fate a man could suffer, especially for kings and chieftains. Defeat often came with something even more devastating than death. It came with public humiliation. And among the most horrifying forms of that humiliation was sexual violation. Not in private, not hidden in the dark, but in front of an audience, with eyes watching and remembering. Because for Vikings, stripping a man of his masculinity in front of others meant stripping him of his authority forever. This practice wasn't widespread in everyday life, but it loomed large in sagas and oral traditions. Captured kings and rival leaders who dared to challenge the wrong people could find themselves subjected to this ultimate punishment. It was not about lust, it was about making a point, a very public point, that the person you once called a ruler was now no more than a symbol of shame. It's hard to imagine any modern politician surviving such a scandal without needing a new identity and a cave to hide in. In these events, the victim was displayed before the crowd, not to be heard, but to be broken. The people attending were not there to witness justice. They were there to witness the fall of a man's identity, his name, his legacy. In Viking terms, it was the removal of his honor covering, something invisible, but very real in their culture. Once torn away, there was no stitching it back. For the crowd, this was not only a moment of entertainment, it was also a warning, a message that echoed through generations. The man who once led armies could not even protect himself. Worse, he could not protect his body from being made into a message. And in a society where physical power was everything, that was the end. Even if he lived afterward, he would be a ghost among the living. What made this worse was that the act was not only physical but symbolic. Being raped, in Viking eyes, wasn't just an act of violence. It meant you were no longer a man. You had crossed into the category of the used, of the submissive, and in their hierarchy, there was no place lower. From that moment on, your voice carried no weight. Your sword meant nothing. Even your kin might refuse to avenge you, because doing so could stain their own names. It's a bit like how, today, losing control of your online image can destroy your career, relationships, and even your place in society. The sagas tell of chieftains who were paraded, tied, and symbolically unmanned in front of former allies and enemies. Some of them died during the act. Others chose death afterward, because in their worldview, it was not just pain they experienced, it was the death of the self, the death of all that they had fought to build. And perhaps the worst part was knowing that the stories would outlive them. In one tale, a leader from a rival clan was captured during a failed raid. Instead of a swift execution, his captors chose a slower path. They bound him, insulted him, and then performed the act that would erase his name from the list of real men. The crowd did not cheer, it stayed quiet, not from respect, but from the weight of what they were witnessing. A line had been crossed, and yet it was a line their culture allowed. The legal codes in parts of Viking society did not protect men from this. On the contrary, if the person performing the act was in a dominant position, and if the community agreed that the victim had brought dishonour, the act could be justified. There were no clear trials for this, no witnesses called. It was judgment by humiliation, a form of justice that carried no appeal. Honestly, even Viking HR departments would have been terrifying. The consequences didn't end with the act. The victim, if he survived, was now a pariah. He might be forced to live in isolation, lose all land rights, or be refused entry to assemblies. His name could be changed in records, or worse, mocked in poetry. In a culture that survived on song and story, being the subject of a mocking poem was a permanent scar. It turned a person into a character, a lesson, a warning. For his family, the shame spread like fire. Brothers might refuse to mention him. Sons might never speak of the legacy. Daughters could find it harder to marry. The idea was that if a man could be dominated, then his blood was weak. This strange belief, irrational as it sounds, was part of the Viking understanding of strength, that it passed through not only muscle and sword play, but also through sexual dominance. It's tragic how cruelty often finds a way to disguise itself as tradition. Not all these stories were real, of course. Many were exaggerated or invented to intimidate enemies or entertain listeners around the fire, but their power lay not in their truth but in their effect. They reminded everyone of the invisible line between power and powerlessness, between honour and eternal shame, and they showed how, in Viking times, violence and sexuality could blend into one terrifying force. In modern eyes, these practices seem impossible to imagine, but they were rooted in a very different way of thinking, a system where a man's body belonged to his reputation, and if the reputation was destroyed, the man might as well vanish. Death was cleaner. It ended the story. But shame kept talking. It moved from lips to ears, from stories to songs, and it never faded. This tells us something uncomfortable about Viking justice. It wasn't just about balance or fairness, it was about hierarchy. And hierarchy, when threatened, used whatever tools it had, even those who broke a man from the inside, even those who used a crowd's silence as a seal of approval. It also reminds us how deep fear can run, to fear not pain, not blood, but disgrace. A disgrace designed not to kill, but to erase. And yet, for some victims, it was still better to die than to keep walking with that weight. What we see here is not just cruelty, but a ritualized cruelty, designed to echo, and that echo, centuries later, still sends a chill through the pages of old sagas. In the next part, we'll turn from kings to everyday men, not the leaders, but the husbands, the ones who feared not the battlefield, but the whispers of their wives behind closed doors. By the time Viking power had taken hold in places like Dublin and York, slavery was no longer a side activity. It had become a well-organised, large-scale enterprise. Slave markets operated with regularity, and women, particularly young and attractive women, were some of the most valuable commodities traded. They weren't destined for fields or kitchens. Many were bought for one purpose only. They were to serve as sexual property. passed between masters or held in the private harems of powerful men. In these markets, merchants didn't bother with subtlety. They inspected women in front of buyers. Age, health, and appearance determined price. Those considered especially beautiful were often withheld from open sale, and instead kept as personal concubines by the wealthiest raiders or local warlords. Others were shipped to distant lands. There are records of Viking traders selling women as far as the Islamic world, where European slaves fetched high prices. Slavery wasn't a byproduct of war, it was often the reason for it. A successful raid didn't just bring back gold or cattle, it filled the ships with captives. Women were chained below deck, sometimes naked, sometimes injured, and always terrified. Once brought back, they were rarely given names. Most were referred to by place of capture or physical traits. Their fate depended entirely on their captor's whim. It's darkly ironic that some people today talk about Vikings as symbols of rugged independence, when so much of their society was built on exploiting the powerless. Slavery in the Viking world wasn't hidden. There was no shame in owning a sex slave. In fact, it was often considered a sign of wealth and success. The more slaves a man kept, the more influential he appeared. Some men had so many they could afford to gift a few to allies or share them during feasts as twisted demonstrations of generosity. The practice was woven into rituals, power plays, and even diplomacy. There was no legal protection for slaves. If a woman resisted, she could be beaten or killed without consequence. Some men even boasted in poetry or runestone inscriptions about the women they took. These weren't coded messages. They were meant to be read, remembered, and feared. A woman's value was measured by how she pleased her owner and how long she could be kept submissive. Some were forced to bear children who then grew up as property themselves. There were slave quarters in the homes of the elite, not just tucked away corners, but entire sections designated for sexual service. These spaces were built with little privacy. Beds were made of straw or fur, often shared between captives. Some slaves were kept pregnant continuously, as their children would also become property. This system wasn't improvised. It was maintained across generations. What shocks modern historians is how normalized all of it was. There's little moral debate in the surviving texts. Even Christian monks who witnessed Viking raids focused more on looted treasures than on the captured women. In their eyes, the destruction of a church was more tragic than the enslavement of dozens of girls. The silence speaks volumes. It's hard to imagine now, but in Viking society, capturing a woman and claiming her body was a path to prestige, not prison. The Viking economy depended heavily on the slave trade. Dublin, for instance, grew into a bustling hub precisely because of its human market. Ships came and went carrying captives from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. The money made from selling slaves helped build ships, fund campaigns, and sustain local power. It was not a hidden underworld. It was the beating heart of commerce. Even in sagas that describe romantic love or noble warriors, slavery is always present in the background. Sometimes the hero frees a captive, but more often, he claims her. There are no happy endings for these women. If they escaped, there was no home to return to. Their status as used property often meant they were rejected even by their own people. That rejection could be worse than captivity itself. Resistance was rare. Survival meant obedience. Some women tried to win favour by becoming indispensable in the household. Others clung to their children as a reason to endure. Escape was nearly impossible. In foreign lands, they had no allies, no language, and no legal status. A few were bought out by sympathetic Christians or monks, but those were exceptions, not norms. I find it deeply unsettling that an entire economy could run smoothly while treating human beings like livestock, and nobody blinked. The trade did have rivals. As Christianity spread, some church figures tried to limit or regulate slavery, but they often failed. Viking lords had more power than bishops in many regions, and wealth from slaves ensured loyalty among warriors. As long as demand remained, the supply continued. There were even attempts to ritualize the selection of slaves. Some markets had appointed officials to oversee fairness not for the captives, but for the buyers. Prices were recorded, disputes were settled in local courts, the system had rules, but none protected the enslaved. They were catalogued, taxed, and traded like any other resource. In a few cases, women born into slavery became concubines who rose in influence. Some managed to gain partial freedom through bearing sons whom the father later recognized. But that path was rare and came with its dangers. If the child died or the father lost power, the woman could be demoted or discarded. By the end of the Viking Age, slavery persisted even as other parts of the world began to question its morality. When Christianity gained firmer hold, the focus shifted, but economic habits were hard to break. The slave trade eventually faded, not because of ethical awakening, but because new forms of wealth replaced it. It's tempting to romanticize the Vikings with their ships, axes, and epic tales, but behind the sails and swords stood hundreds of terrified women, each one a victim of an economy that saw their bodies as currency. No saga sings their names, no monument marks their graves. Yet without them, Viking society would not have thrived. Next, we'll look deeper into the religious justification used to make all of this seem acceptable. When gods and greed joined forces, brutality became a divine right. While Viking society might appear wild and lawless to the modern eye, it operated under a complex system of rules, but these laws didn't treat everyone equally. When it came to sexual violence, the line between justice and injustice was drawn not by the nature of the act but by the status of the victim. Her freedom was a measure of a woman's legal worth. Her humanity was not assumed. It had to be proven. In the case of a free woman, someone born to a recognized family, with community standing and family protection, rape was treated as a serious crime. The punishment could be death. The attacker risked being hunted by the woman's kin, or tried and executed if caught. These consequences were known, and fear of retribution often served as a deterrent. But for enslaved women, the laws read differently. If a man raped a female slave, he didn't face execution. He was fined, not for violating her body, but for damaging someone else's property. The offence was placed in the same category as breaking a tool or injuring livestock. Payment went to the slave's owner, not the woman herself. She wasn't viewed as the injured party, she was the object. It's painfully absurd that a man could be fined more for stealing a cow than for violating a woman, just because she was enslaved. This system wasn't a loophole, it was intentional. Legal codes like the Gregas in Iceland and other regional laws across Scandinavia spelled out the differences clearly. A free woman had value tied to her reputation and her family's honour. Her purity had economic and social implications, especially in marriage arrangements. That made her body legally protected, but a slave had no such value. Her role was to serve, and her body was seen as part of that function. Some men even bought female slaves precisely because the law allowed them unrestricted access. It was seen as a benefit of ownership. The legal language reinforced this. Phrases in the text described slaves as available for use, and there were even market listings that highlighted a slave's sexual availability as a selling point. Children born from these encounters added to the complexity. If the child had a free father, he might be accepted into society. But if the father denied paternity, the child was born into slavery. The woman had no say. Some men used this ambiguity to expand their household labour force. Others sold the children. The law didn't intervene. It's like drawing a legal border through the middle of a woman's body, saying one half has rights and the other doesn't. Occasionally, a slave owner could punish someone else for abusing his property. But this had less to do with justice and more with control. If a rival raped a man's slave, the issue wasn't the violation of the woman, it was the disrespect shown to the owner. That's how twisted the logic became. The woman's suffering remained invisible. Survivors had no recourse for complaint. They couldn't appear in court, couldn't testify, and couldn't seek restitution. If they became pregnant, they were expected to keep working. If they resisted or tried to escape, they could be flogged, confined, or even mutilated. Some women endured years of abuse from multiple masters, passed around or gifted like utensils. The law didn't blink. What makes this particularly disturbing is how openly it was accepted. There's little evidence of protest or discomfort in the legal texts. Scholars and poets didn't question the morality. Even religious figures who later came into contact with these laws often remained silent. The legal framework had been crafted to protect the system, not its victims. I can't help but feel a deep frustration reading these laws, knowing that people spent more time arguing about sheep ownership than about a woman's right to her body. This legal structure also created an unspoken hierarchy among women themselves. Free women knew their rights were conditional. If they fell from favour, lost family protection, or were captured, they could slip into the slave category. Some even married their former captors to avoid that fate. The threat was real and ever-present. The laws extended to the display of women's bodies as well. Female slaves could be paraded, touched, and examined in ways that would be considered violations if done to free women. It created a culture where abuse became routine. In some towns, slave women were used in fertility rituals, subjected to acts under the guise of religious blessing. Consent was never part of the equation. Some men tried to justify these practices by invoking traditional necessity. They claimed that in times of war, taking women was normal, even expected. Others insisted that laws must preserve the rights of owners to manage their property. These excuses hardened into legal precedent. Over time, what began as an atrocity became routine. The worst part is that these laws remained in place for centuries. Even as Christian norms began influencing Viking regions, the legal difference between free and enslaved women persisted. The church tried to ban slavery in theory, but in practice, it made few efforts to change how women were treated. As long as slaves remained economically useful, the system stayed intact. In a way, these laws reveal how the Vikings weren't just brutal, they were brutally organised. Their cruelty wasn't chaotic, it was systematic. The more one studies these codes, the more one sees how law and violence work together. The law didn't exist to prevent abuse, it existed to regulate it. Victims became lines in a ledger, and justice was a transaction. Eventually, as Viking influence declined and local rulers shifted toward more centralized governance, some of these laws were repealed or replaced, but not before generations of women had suffered under them. Their stories remain largely unrecorded. No court transcripts, no memorials, just scattered references in legal scrolls and market ledgers. It's tempting to look back and say, that was a different time, but every system is built by choices, and the Viking laws chose power over compassion. They chose property rights over human rights, and they made sure that women at the bottom had no voice at all. In the next part, we'll explore how these legal structures were reflected in Viking storytelling. Even in their myths, the same patterns of power, control, and silence can be found. Stories of Viking brutality were not limited to what they did. Sometimes, it was what people feared they might do that caused the most damage. In certain cases, entire villages surrendered before a single sword was drawn. The raiders knew this. They let their reputation do the work. Whispers of terror travelled faster than sails. That whisper carried tales of violence, fire, and sexual humiliation. Many of those stories turned out to be true, but the real power lay in how people reacted to the possibility of them being true. Viking leaders understood that fear could achieve more than steel. They used it strategically. Villages that heard rumours of previous atrocities often chose to abandon their homes or offer tribute, hoping to avoid destruction. This tactic saved resources and reduced casualties. For the Vikings, it was an efficient way to conquer. It didn't require as many ships or as much blood, just fear, just memory, just a suggestion. When word spread that the Vikings had raped and enslaved the women of one town, Nearby settlements packed up and fled. The longships had not even arrived yet. People preferred uncertainty in the wilderness over certainty in their own homes. That was the true reach of terror. It became a shadow hanging over every coast, every fjord, every inland village that had something to lose. The tactic was not always explicit. There were no printed flyers or battle plans declaring that fear would be weaponized. But it was obvious in how often the same outcomes repeated. People yielded not to physical attacks, but to the fear of losing their bodies, their dignity, their families. And the Vikings encouraged this. They rarely tried to correct the rumours. Sometimes, they even added to them. It's a bit like spreading bad reviews about yourself so people stop arguing with you. When you become the monster in everyone's story, you don't have to lift a finger to frighten them. The silence of an incoming raid was often worse than the noise, because in silence, the imagination filled in the blanks. Over time, the psychological weight of Viking conquest grew. Villagers told their children that monsters came from the sea. Priests warned their flocks to stay faithful or face punishment like the coastal settlements. Local leaders submitted gifts ahead of time, hoping to avoid attention, diplomacy born from desperation. The Viking Age was not just about blades. It was about building a presence so terrifying that people chose compliance before conflict. In many cases, sexual violence was not even required. The memory of it was enough. When survivors returned with tales of humiliation, those stories spread farther than any raiding party. This cycle turned fear into infrastructure. It kept people obedient. It discouraged rebellion. It broke resistance before it had time to form. It's strange to think they invented a kind of psychological warfare centuries before modern propaganda. No leaflets were dropped. No speeches were made. Just pain remembered and pain anticipated. That alone guided entire regions to their knees. Of course, not all raids ended in horror. Some villages were spared. Some raiders kept their discipline, but that didn't stop the fear from growing, because unpredictability was part of the fear. No one could be sure if this time they would be ignored or violated. That randomness forced communities to assume the worst and act accordingly. I think the scariest part is that fear worked better than fighting. Entire provinces collapsed without a single battle. The Vikings could march in and take what they wanted because people had already surrendered in their minds. In that sense, the real invasion happened long before the sails reached the shore. This strategy had economic benefits too. Less fighting meant fewer casualties on both sides. It meant raiders could move quickly, gathering wealth and slaves without long engagements. The efficiency was terrifying. They didn't just raid bodies, they raided minds. That emotional plunder left deeper scars. Trauma lasted longer than broken walls. Families separated by fear never found one another again. Communities that once stood proud now scattered across forests and mountains, unwilling to return. The physical destruction could be rebuilt. The mental damage endured. In many cases, local rulers tried to hide their fear. They built palisades. They trained militias. But none of it mattered when the people themselves chose flight over fight. Armies crumbled because no one believed they could win. It's hard to rally troops when the memory of defeat arrives before the enemy. Women bore the brunt of this terror, whether or not they were ever touched. The threat hung over them constantly. Their value became tied to purity and survival. That made them even more vulnerable. They were targets not just of violence, but of rumour and shame. In many regions, the fear of rape-shaped migration, defence, and diplomacy. Sometimes, even noble families abandoned their estates. Castles were traded for exile. Wealth was hidden in wells or buried in fields. The landscape itself held evidence of this fear. Long after the Vikings left, people dug up their own memories along with their valuables. Stories turned into bones. Bones turned into history. Imagine a company firing its CEO because someone heard Vikings were hiring. That's how disproportionate the reaction could be. Fear did not scale with facts, it scaled with imagination. And the Vikings, knowingly or not, used that to their advantage. I personally find this tactic even more unsettling than open war. It means they didn't always need to fight to win. They didn't need to spill blood to take land. Just being terrifying was enough. That's power in its purest form, not strength, but influence. Not force, but fear. As we move further, we will leave the battlefield behind and enter the markets. There, fear did not just drive surrender, it fueled entire economies. The trade in bodies, born from this terror, became a business too large to ignore. In Viking society, a wedding did not end at the altar or the drinking hall. The true confirmation came later, behind closed doors, under linen sheets, with witnesses nearby. A marriage was not considered fully valid until the couple proved it physically. That proof was not symbolic, it was literal. Someone had to confirm that the union had been consummated. Without that moment, witnessed in some form, the marriage could be challenged or dismissed altogether. This may sound invasive, but it was standard practice. In many Viking households, especially among the wealthy or noble families, the bedding ceremony was semi-public. Trusted members from both sides of the family might wait outside the room. In some cases, they were even permitted to enter and observe just enough to verify that physical contact had occurred. This was not treated as entertainment. It was serious business. Marriage meant property, alliances, inheritance, and status. Without consummation, none of those rights were secure. The bedding cloth, often plain linen, became legal evidence. If blood was present on the sheet, it confirmed that the bride was a virgin and that intercourse had taken place. This cloth might be shown to the family, preserved for legal disputes, or even referenced in inheritance trials. If no blood appeared, or if witnesses were not satisfied with what they heard or saw, the entire wedding might be called into question. It's as if your marriage license today came with a required photo of your bed afterward. While shocking to modern sensibilities, for the Vikings, this was part of maintaining order. Proof mattered. Words were not enough. A bride's purity and a groom's performance were both expected to meet community standards, not just personal ones. The pressure on the groom was immense. It was not simply about physical ability, it was about honour. Failing to perform on the wedding night could mean shame, lawsuits, or even divorce. If the bride's family believed the husband was unable to complete the act, they had the right to pursue compensation or annul the marriage. This was not hypothetical. Viking law codes and sagas describe such cases, with men forced to defend their bedroom actions in front of elders and councils. I can't imagine a worse start to married life than being summoned to explain what didn't happen in bed. That kind of scrutiny would make anyone anxious. Yet for the Vikings, it was normal. A man's ability to fulfill his sexual duty was a measure of his fitness to lead a household. It proved that he was healthy, virile, and capable of producing heirs. Anything less was a potential disaster for both families. For women, the expectations were equally high. While much focus was placed on the bloodied sheet as proof of virginity, the consequences of failing to produce that proof varied. In some cases, the woman was blamed. In others, the man was accused of lying or being physically weak. Accusations could fly in both directions. The wedding night, far from being a private moment of intimacy, was essentially a test, pass or fail, and others were watching, literally or metaphorically. Among the nobility, this process was even more formalized. In some regions, a priest or chieftain would bless the bed, touch the sheets, or place symbols of fertility in the room. Guests would lead the couple to the chamber with songs and drinking horns. But after the laughter faded, the pressure remained. The outcome of that night might determine the future of farms, kingdoms, or dynasties. It's remarkable how something so personal became a form of social inspection. The Viking world did not separate the private from the public. Everything, even love and sex, served the structure of the clan. One weak moment could unravel carefully arranged alliances. This is why the bedding ceremony was not an afterthought. It was the climax of negotiation and promise. Some sagas even describe how disputes erupted when a groom failed to satisfy his bride. She might return to her father's house and demand justice. The father, seeing his daughter dishonoured or neglected, could sue for damages or break the marriage bond. A woman might not have had political power, but her sexual status carried legal weight. If violated or unfulfilled, she had tools to retaliate, at least within the framework of her class. Even more curiously, there are records of men being forced to provide testimony that they had completed the act, sometimes with witnesses who attested to the sounds or signs from behind a curtain. These bizarre forms of verification were taken seriously. The law did not care how uncomfortable it was. What mattered was certainty. Honestly, this is one of those historical facts that makes me glad I live in the modern world. There may still be pressure to perform, but at least there's no linen test waiting to be presented to your in-laws. These customs remind us how deeply sex and law were intertwined in the past. For the Vikings, nothing was purely emotional or romantic. Everything had a purpose. Everything had a function. Even the act of love was a contract, and like all contracts, it needed proof. The sheet did not just absorb blood, it absorbed expectation, fear, and the weight of social order. That one night could define a person's reputation for life. It could make or break fortunes. It could even lead to violence if disputes turned bitter. What remains fascinating is that these practices were not seen as cruel by those who lived them. They were seen as necessary. In a world where lineage, fertility, and property were constantly under threat, the wedding night became a legal checkpoint. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew what was expected. Whether or not they liked it was beside the point. As we move forward, we'll leave the bedroom behind and step into the realm of mythology, where even the gods played dangerous games with sex, deception, and power. By the time the wedding night ended and the bloodied sheet was examined, there was little illusion left about what Viking marriage truly was. What started as a union between two people quickly revealed itself as a transaction between two families. In most Viking households, especially among those with land, livestock, or titles, feelings were secondary. What mattered was the dowry, the inheritance rights, and the strength of alliances. Husbands and wives were expected to fulfill roles, not chase personal dreams. The idea that a couple might marry for love was rare and not especially praised. From the beginning, the process of betrothal involved negotiations, sometimes resembling the trading of cattle. The bride's family had to offer goods, coins, or land to secure the match. The groom's family might provide gifts in return. This was not seen as cynical. It was seen as practical. Marriage was how property moved. It was how clans expanded their influence and settled old feuds. Romance was a luxury few could afford. For the bride, her body became a form of currency. Virginity was expected, and the wedding night was the moment of proof. That night, as described earlier, might be witnessed, or at the very least, monitored. The entire community knew what was expected. She had little say in the matter. Fathers, brothers, and uncles made the decisions. Her future was often sealed before she turned 15. It's hard not to notice that the Vikings treated marriage like a well-wrapped business deal with a side of bedding. The rituals were rich, but the motives were calculated. A wealthy bride increased a man's status. A strong man protected a weaker family. These exchanges made sense in a society built on survival and expansion, but it came at a cost to the individual. Sex itself became part of the transaction. The right to a woman's body was transferred alongside her dowry. Once married, she was expected to provide children. If she failed, it could be grounds for divorce. Her husband, meanwhile, was not always expected to remain faithful. Viking men, especially those with power, often kept concubines or slept with slaves. The law rarely punished this behaviour. Fidelity was demanded mostly of women. At times, The transaction was so blatant that family members literally stayed in the room to verify consummation. This was not symbolic. In some parts of Scandinavia, it was customary for a relative to wait nearby, listening through the wall, or even standing silently in the corner until the act began. This intrusion, disturbing as it sounds now, was not mocked. It was part of ensuring that the deal had been sealed. In today's world, such a wedding night would probably land someone in court, not in the family album. But in the Viking Age, it was the norm. Social proof carried more weight than privacy. A completed union meant security for both families. Everyone needed to be sure that what was promised had been delivered. The woman's opinion mattered little. Even if she resisted, the marriage might proceed. Her consent, while sometimes requested, was not required. Fathers had the final say, and once given away, she became her husband's responsibility. Her body, her labour, and her fertility became his property in the eyes of society. This reality extended beyond the wedding night. For the rest of her life, a Viking wife was judged by her ability to produce sons, manage the household, and remain obedient. If she failed, or if rumours spread that she was barren or disobedient, her husband had legal options. He could replace her, return her to her family, or take another wife if local customs allowed. Divorce existed, but it too was shaped by economics. Whoever controlled the wealth usually controlled the outcome. I often find it difficult to imagine how these women must have felt, knowing their worth was measured in goats and gold. Some may have found ways to resist, to negotiate better matches, or to find affection within these harsh systems. But many simply accepted their role. Their mothers had gone through it. Their daughters would too. Among the upper classes, these transactions were even more intricate. Kings and jarls married to gain land or ships. Their brides were often chosen from rival clans to prevent war. In some cases, young girls were promised in marriage before they had even reached puberty. They were sent away to unfamiliar lands, dressed in fine clothes, but with no control over their own fate. Ceremonies were lavish, with songs and feasting. But beneath the music, the calculation remained. A man married to extend his influence. A woman married to secure her family's future. The act of marriage was not about happiness. It was about survival. There were exceptions. Stories exist of couples who genuinely cared for each other, who found love after marriage, or who married in secret defiance of tradition. But these were not the norm. In most cases, marriage was a tool. It was how society moved forward. One wedding could shape a generation. Even within peasant households, where wealth was minimal, the same logic applied. A young man might marry the daughter of a neighbouring farmer to gain access to fertile land. Her dowry might be a few sheep or a cart, but the principle was the same. The bride brought value, the groom offered status. Their union was a bargain, signed with a feast and sealed with a bed. The idea that love would come later was a hope, not a plan. And if it didn't come, the marriage would continue anyway. Divorce was available but discouraged. A broken marriage meant shame and instability. Better to stay together, even in cold silence, than to disrupt the fragile network of obligations. It's both fascinating and sad to see how deeply social needs shaped personal lives. In the Viking world, emotions were private burdens. Duty came first. The system worked, but it left little room for individuality. In the next part, we'll explore how these expectations played out when things went wrong, especially for women accused of breaking the rules. Their punishments were brutal and their options few. In the world of the Vikings, honour extended far beyond battlefield courage. It reached into the bedroom after a wedding. If the bride was disappointed or felt that her husband had failed to perform his duty, it was not just a matter of private embarrassment. It was grounds for legal action. The law recognised that sexual fulfilment was part of the marriage contract, and failing to deliver on that contract could result in public shame and financial penalties. The idea of suing someone for being bad in bed may sound like a joke today, but in Viking society, It was deadly serious. The marriage was considered incomplete if the groom failed to consummate it. In some regions, the bride's family could challenge the validity of the union and demand compensation. If the husband could not perform or refuse to, his reputation would suffer. And in a culture where masculinity was constantly tested, this kind of failure was not easy to hide. It's wild to think there was once a society where your bedroom skills could end up in a courtroom. The Vikings had a practical reason for it. Marriage wasn't just for companionship. It was meant to produce children and unite families. If a man could not fulfill that biological and social role, he was seen as defective. And just like with any defective goods, a refund or exchange might be demanded. In some laws, there were specific terms for this. A man who failed to satisfy his bride could be labelled unfit. This wasn't just a social insult. It could mean losing property or being forced to pay damages. Legal documents even included clauses that allowed for annulment if there was no physical consummation. The bride, or more often her family, had the right to present evidence, and witnesses could be called. That evidence might be medical or symbolic. Blood on the bedsheets was one form of proof, but it was not always present. The word of the bride carried weight, especially if supported by her relatives. If the husband had enemies, they might use the occasion to humiliate him further. What began as a private matter could quickly become public gossip. His standing in the village or clan could be damaged beyond repair. In some places, a husband could be given time to try again. But if he failed a second time, there were no more chances. Compensation was required. Sometimes, the marriage would be dissolved. Other times, the wife would remain, but her family would be given goods, silver, or livestock to make up for the insult. It was an attempt to balance the social equation. The pressure on men was enormous. Performance in the bedroom became another form of combat, another test of worth. A young man who boasted of conquest before marriage might find himself humbled if he could not live up to his claims. His bride might laugh behind closed doors. Worse, she might talk. That talk could travel, and once it did, his chances of remarrying or earning respect were gone. In modern terms, imagine being rated like a broken product and having to pay damages for a bad honeymoon. Of course, today's laws no longer operate that way. But in the Viking world, where almost everything was tied to family reputation, nothing was off limits, not even the most private acts. Some sagas mention cases where a groom's failure led to bloodshed. If the wife's family felt insulted or tricked, they might retaliate. What began as a quiet accusation could escalate into clan violence. A brother might feel dishonoured, a father might demand revenge. This was not only about the couple, it was about family pride. It's hard not to feel sympathy for both sides in this arrangement. The bride, possibly a teenager, was pressured to deliver proof of her purity and now forced to complain about something intimate. The groom, maybe nervous or inexperienced, is now branded as unmanly. Neither one had much control. Both were trapped in a system that reduced human connection to expectation and tradition. It was not just newlyweds who faced this scrutiny. Widows who remarried also had to prove the success of their new unions. If they had children from a previous marriage, their fertility was considered tested, but if not, the pressure remained. The husband had to prove he could do what was expected. In such cases, failure carried even more shame. These legal and social expectations served to uphold the Viking ideal of strength and virility. A man who failed to satisfy his wife was seen as weak. Weakness had no place in Viking society. Everything about their world rewarded dominance. Even love was expected to look like conquest. At times, these laws led to strange rituals. In some regions, if the groom was rumoured to be unfit, a village elder might be asked to confirm his manhood. This could mean awkward interviews or, in extreme cases, physical examinations. These practices were not common everywhere, but they highlight the level of obsession with male performance. The anxiety this created must have been intense. Young men feared failure. Fathers feared shame. Families feared the cost of returning a bride. The wedding night became a trial, and success meant everything. The joy of marriage was buried under a mountain of expectations. Some tried to cheat the system. There are stories of couples faking consummation, staining sheets with animal blood, or bribing witnesses. But such tricks were dangerous. If discovered, they led to harsher punishment, and worse, they undermined the very fabric of trust between families. Over time, as Christianity spread and local customs changed, some of these rules softened, but during the peak of Viking culture, they were real and rigid. The line between personal failure and public disgrace was very thin. It always surprises me how something as intimate as sex was treated with the same cold logic as land or cattle. In the end, Viking marriage was never about two people. It was about families, honour, and legacy. And in that framework, failure in the bedroom became failure in life. In the next part, we'll look deeper into what happened when women, not men, were accused of sexual shortcomings. Their punishments were no less cruel, and the expectations they faced were just as harsh. Among all the shocking customs in Viking society, perhaps none is more disturbing than what happened during the funeral of a powerful leader. Death did not only involve mourning, it became a ritual of dominance, legacy, and ritualized sexual violence. And at the center of it all was one woman, a slave, chosen not for her closeness to the dead, but for her role as an offering. Her final hours were not quiet or private. They were public, brutal, and filled with acts that still haunt historians today. The most detailed account of this ritual comes from a 10th century Arab traveller named Ahmad ibn Fadlan. He witnessed a Viking funeral on the banks of the Volga River and recorded what he saw. A nobleman had died. His ship was to become his grave, but before the flames would consume him, a female slave was chosen to accompany him into the afterlife. She did not volunteer out of love. She was selected, or more accurately, forced. Once chosen, the woman was treated like a sacred object. She was washed, dressed, paraded, and told that she would soon join her master. Her body was to carry his spirit forward. But before that, the most unsettling part of the ritual began. She was passed from man to man. One by one, members of the tribe had intercourse with her. Some did it gently, others roughly. It was not about pleasure. It was about charging her with what they believed was life force. It's hard to imagine a more horrifying farewell party than one that ends with public rape and a funeral pyre. And yet, in the logic of Viking death rituals, it made sense. They believed the dead needed strength in the afterlife. That strength could be passed through sexual energy. So the woman's body became a vessel for that transfer. Her suffering was ignored. Her consent is irrelevant. In the final moments, she was taken aboard the ship. Her master's body lay on cushions, surrounded by weapons and goods. The woman, broken and resigned, was placed next to him. A priest or elder came forward. In some versions, he gave her a drink laced with herbs. In others, he whispered words meant to calm her. Then, as drums beat, she was stabbed to death. Sometimes once, sometimes many times. Her body, still warm, was arranged next to the corpse of her master. Fire was set to the ship. The wind carried the flames high. The people watched. They sang. They believed they had honoured their leader. They believed the slave girl had become something more than a servant, that she had helped him cross into the next world with strength. But what they really created was a moment of unimaginable cruelty, masked as sacred duty. Looking at this through a modern lens, it feels like a mix of a funeral, a crime scene, and a cult initiation. Yet no one was punished, no one hid. This was tradition. It was recorded in detail, celebrated even, and it was not a one-time event. Archaeological finds suggest similar rituals happened in multiple regions, with slight variations. What is perhaps most chilling is the ritual's theatrical nature. Everyone had a role. The woman's screams were not silenced but heard. The people sang louder. They believed that her cries gave power to the fire, that her pain fueled the soul of the dead man. This was not hidden violence. It was a spectacle. It always unsettles me how something so openly brutal could be seen as holy. But in Viking society, violence was not evil if it served tradition. The line between sacred and savage barely existed, and once it was crossed, no one looked back. The funeral was a stage. The dead man is the star. But the woman, forced into the final act, carried the weight of the story. In some cases, she was told she would be honoured in the afterlife, that she would sit beside her master in the halls of the gods. But such promises were empty. No one asked what she wanted. Her body was used. Her name was never recorded. Some scholars argue that not all Viking funerals were this way, and that the account by Ibn Fadlan described a specific tribe, not all Norse people. That may be true, but the presence of similar customs in burial sites from Norway to Russia suggests a wider pattern. Whether it happened often or rarely, the fact remains that it did happen, and it was accepted. People have tried to excuse it by saying it was just the culture, but culture does not erase pain, it only wraps it in ceremony. For the slave girl, her last day was not about belief or meaning, it was about endurance. Her suffering became tradition. Her voice was drowned out by fire and song. The idea that sex could cleanse, charge, or empower the dead shows how distorted things became. Instead of love or respect, death was paired with dominance. The man who died still ruled, even in silence, even in ashes. His authority stretched beyond breath, enforced by the violence inflicted on another. There are reports that some women volunteered for this role, that they saw it as an honour. But even then, it is hard to separate true choice from social pressure. In a world where women had little value unless attached to a man, being part of a great man's death might have seemed like a better fate than being sold again. But a choice made under fear is no choice at all. The use of sex in Viking funerals blurs every line we draw between public and private, holy and obscene. It reminds us how deeply woven these beliefs were into the fabric of life and death. There was no moment of peace, no gentle passing. Everything was loud, hot, and violent, even the end. Sometimes I wonder what that woman thought in her final hour, lying next to a corpse, waiting for the blade. We will never know. All we have are the records of the men who watched, wrote, and kept her nameless. Next, we will enter the even murkier world of what Viking children were taught about sex and gender, when play and punishment started blending far too early. The stories of Viking funerals might sound like legends, but the soil of Scandinavia tells a quieter, more chilling truth. What was once recorded in words by travellers and scribes is now being confirmed with bones, ash, and burial ships. In places like Norway and Sweden, the land has preserved not only the bodies of the dead, but also the silent marks of what was done to them. These marks whisper of pain, of ritual, and of a culture where violence could be sacred if cloaked in tradition. One of the most famous discoveries is the Oseberg ship burial, found in a mound in Norway. Inside were two women. One was elderly, perhaps a queen or high-status priestess. The other was younger, her remains showing signs of a violent death. The placement of the bodies, the richness of the grave goods, and the overall grandeur of the burial suggest that this was no ordinary event. It was a ritual, and perhaps a sacrifice. Some researchers believe the younger woman was a servant or slave, chosen to accompany her mistress into the afterlife. Her death was not random. It was a message. That loyalty must continue beyond the grave, for a journey to the next world required not only riches and symbols, but blood. The way her body was arranged, the lack of defensive wounds, and the silence around her name all point to a controlled killing, likely done in ceremony. If modern funerals included stabbing a co-worker and burning them with the CEO, people might ask a few more questions. Yet for the Vikings, this was power on display, a final statement about hierarchy, about control. The Osberg ship was a floating tomb, a declaration that even death could not separate master from servant, and this is not an isolated case. Across the Viking world, similar burial mounds have revealed troubling patterns. In some, the skeletons of women show signs of blunt force trauma. In others, there are multiple bodies placed unnaturally close, suggesting a mass ritual. Some graves even contain remnants of bindings or positioning that seem more ceremonial than accidental. These patterns tell a consistent story, that sexual and symbolic violence was woven into the death rituals of certain Viking communities, and not only for the powerful. In less elaborate graves, there are still traces of this mindset. A woman was buried with her arms crossed unnaturally tight, a shallow wound placed on the chest, not deep enough to kill, but symbolic in placement. It seems the afterlife was not simply awaited, but forcefully constructed. It feels like the Viking view of the afterlife was half religion, half theatre, and entirely terrifying. The ship became a stage. The participants had roles. The script required suffering, and the audience believed they were watching something divine. This belief did not only allow for violence, it demanded it. In several burial sites, archaeologists have found charms and objects linked to fertility and sexuality. Small carvings, tools used for grooming, and even herbs associated with arousal or menstruation. These items were not just practical, they were symbolic, meant to carry energy into the next life. The idea was that a dead person, especially a leader, needed not only strength and food, but also vitality and sexual power. And that power came from someone else's body. Sometimes I wonder how many women were buried in silence while the world only remembered the men they served. Their stories are never told. Their names were never carved. They are recorded as unknown female, as possible servant, or worse, simply as part of the burial environment. But each one had a voice, a life, a last breath. In some mounds, it is not just bones that speak. Soil samples have revealed traces of bodily fluids, of violence, and even of burned garments that suggest ritual nudity. These are not assumptions. They are facts, preserved through centuries. They tell us that the violence of these rituals was not a myth, but a daily practice for some. Not every Viking burial was this way, of course, but enough of them follow the pattern to paint a broader picture. The shocking part is how systematic it was. This was not a moment of panic or passion. It was organised. Items were prepared. The participants rehearsed. There were likely prayers, songs, and spectators. The idea of burying a person with sexual energy transferred from another was not seen as disturbing. It was seen as necessary. The link between sex and death was powerful. To die well, a man had to be honoured not just with gold or swords, but with the forced offering of another's body. This concept did not exist in isolation. It was tied to beliefs about strength, reputation, and masculinity. A man's final passage had to reflect his status. If he was great in life, he deserved something more than silence. He deserved a spectacle. The women chosen for these acts were tools in that spectacle, whether they were slaves, concubines, or servants. Their worth ended when the man's life did. They were not mourned, they were praised for fulfilling a duty. This erasure, this sacrifice of personhood, is perhaps the cruelest part of all. A death not remembered, a role not chosen, a body turned into symbolism. The more I read these burial reports, the more I feel like the earth itself is still trying to confess what happened. Each bone fragment, each piece of shipwood, each smudge of ash, they whisper of pain and of how easily people can use belief to justify horror. In classrooms, Viking history is sometimes taught with awe. The ships, the raids, the sagas. But beneath the shields and axes, there is another history. One of the silenced women, of public cruelty, of rituals dressed in ceremony but soaked in fear. What these archaeological sites confirm is that the legends were not exaggerations. If anything, they were edited, softened. What really happened in those mounds, in those final moments before flame or dirt covered the body, was worse than most stories dared to tell. Now that we've uncovered what was done in death, it's time to look at what the Vikings believed about birth and reproduction, because the obsession with power over the body began long before anyone died. In Viking society, freedom was not just about whether a person could travel or trade. It reached deep into their private lives, including their personal autonomy over their own bodies. Free women had rights, protections, and even some power in relationships. Slave women had none. The difference was more than legal. It was a brutal divide between being a person and being property. Free Viking women could divorce their husbands if they were mistreated or unsatisfied. They could keep property from their family, inherit land, and even go to court. In the sagas, some women stand up boldly before councils or take part in decisions usually left to men. Their voices were not always equal, but at least they were allowed to speak. For slave women, it was a different world. They were often taken during raids and sold in markets like Dublin or York. These women had no right to say no, no access to courts, and no ability to marry by choice. If they had children, those children usually belonged to their owners. Their bodies were treated like tools, used for labour or pleasure, whichever was more profitable. If your ability to say no depends on a receipt from your master, something is terribly wrong. Slave women were not seen as full people under Viking law. They were listed next to livestock, tools, or clothing. This wasn't hidden. It was openly written into law codes and sagas. The legal systems of the time made clear that the value of a woman's body depended on her status. This divide created two parallel lives for women. One life allowed a woman to stand in a hall and challenge her husband's honour. The other life forced a woman to sleep on straw and be touched by whoever claimed ownership of her. Sometimes they lived in the same household, a free wife and a female slave, but their rights and their pain were never equal. Slave women were often forced to bear children for their owners. These children could increase the owner's wealth or be raised in the household. Sometimes, a male owner would free his slave after she gave birth. Other times, she would be sold again. The child might grow up hearing tales of freedom, while the mother never knew a day without fear. It reminds me how in today's world, some women fight for better pay, while others fight just to be safe at night. Progress, even when real, does not reach everyone at the same speed. In the Viking Age, even the little steps forward for free women meant nothing to those still in chains. There are records of slave women trying to escape or being punished for resisting sexual advances. The punishments were harsh and public. Whipping, branding, or forced exposure were all possible. No one was punished for raping a slave. The only concern was whether damage had been done to another man's property. This mindset was enforced from the top down. Laws did not protect slave women from abuse. Instead, they outlined fines for damaging a slave, as if she were a barrel or a sword. Her pain was not the issue. Her owner's loss was... The idea of consent did not apply to her. Her body was just part of the household inventory. I often wonder what stories those women would tell if anyone had cared to ask. Their names are not recorded in the sagas, their voices are not in the poetry, but their presence is felt in the silence between lines, in the gaps where human life is reduced to property. In a cold way, their suffering is treated as routine. This imbalance extended beyond law. It shaped rituals, daily life, and how communities saw themselves. Slave women were expected to be available, obedient, and invisible. If they showed emotion or resistance, they were considered dangerous. Even kindness from a master could turn cruel if the slave forgot her place. Meanwhile, a free woman could use the law to claim abuse or neglect. She might even gain sympathy or support from her kin. This protection created the appearance of a fair society, but only for those at the top. For every woman who had the right to speak, dozens could not even whisper. In some households, this power imbalance created strange relationships. A wife might grow jealous of a female slave. A child might be born to both women but raised as unequal. The home became a stage where dominance and vulnerability played out in quiet patterns, seen but rarely named. Even burial customs reflected this split. Free women were sometimes buried with fine jewellery, combs, or cooking tools. Slave women, if buried at all, were often found in less formal graves, sometimes without ceremony. Some were even sacrificed at funerals to serve their masters in death. Their deaths were not considered crimes. They were seen as useful. The Viking system was built on layers. At the top were men of power. Below them, free women who had some rights but still answered to men. At the bottom, slave women had no rights at all. Their suffering was not hidden. It was part of how the system worked. When we look at Viking history, we often focus on ships, weapons, and exploration. But the real story lies in the rooms where no songs were sung, in the quiet corners of homes where one woman sat at the table and another cleaned it while nursing her bruises, in the way pain was normalized and voices were left unheard. The legal codes of the time did not try to hide the cruelty. They organized it. They named it. They made rules for how much damage was too much and what price to pay if a slave was killed. But not because they cared for the slave, because they cared for the man who owned her. This was not a culture of uncontrolled violence. It was controlled, legalized, and justified. The law was not about justice. It was about order, and order meant keeping each person in their place. It's hard to admire Viking strength when so much of it rested on the backs of those who could not fight back. Stories of glory often forget the cost, but bones remember, laws remember, and silence remembers too. As we move deeper into Viking customs, we will begin to explore the most private rituals of all, not just how they lived and ruled, but how they tried to heal and cleanse, because even in a brutal society, people still searched for purity, even if it meant washing blood with more blood. As we go deeper into the daily violence of Viking life, it's tempting to imagine women only as victims, but history rarely fits into neat categories. While many women suffered under Viking patriarchy, some were part of the system that created and maintained it. They were not always silent, or passive, or kind. A few of them stood beside the men, pushed the wheel of violence forward, and took pride in doing so. There were Viking women who sailed, traded, ruled, and fought. Archaeologists have found female burials with weapons, horses, and armour, indicating these women held real authority. Some led raids, others managed large farms or households while the men were away. A woman might control dozens of slaves, trade goods across seas, and defend her village with a sword. She was not hidden behind a curtain. She was out in the open, part of the engine of conquest. In some sagas, women goad their male relatives into acts of sexual revenge. A mother might urge her son to violate a captive for honour. A wife might mock her husband until he proved his dominance over a rival. Their words are sharp, deliberate, and tied to ideas of manhood and pride. The act itself was violent, but the push behind it came from the home. When family dinners end in "go avenge me" by violating that guy, you know something's wrong with the social script. These weren't accidents. They were accepted behaviours that linked family honour with dominance over others. Women who used this power weren't outsiders. They were insiders shaping the rules. It's uncomfortable to admit that women helped enforce systems that harmed other women, but many of them did. Free women were often in charge of female slaves. They punished disobedience, arranged sexual access for their husbands or guests, and expected absolute submission. A slave's suffering was the price of her mistress's comfort. It reminds me of modern workplaces where one woman finally gets promoted, only to uphold the same unfair system she once fought. Power is not always used to lift others. Sometimes it is used to maintain distance. There are accounts of women overseeing the preparation of slave women for rituals. This included combing their hair, choosing their clothes, and instructing them on how to behave before being assaulted. These rituals were not just allowed, they were structured, rehearsed, and carried out with cold efficiency. Women played a role in making them happen. Some women also served as priestesses or leaders of cult ceremonies. These rites often had sexual elements, especially during funerals or fertility festivals. The female leaders weren't victims in these moments. They were organisers. They decided who was offered, who received the blessing, and who watched. Their role was not always violent, but it was rarely innocent. I sometimes think we overlook how easily cruelty becomes tradition when no one questions it. Women in Viking society did not escape the system. They were raised in it. Some challenged it. Others embraced it. The result was a culture where pain had many authors. This does not mean all Viking women were cruel. Many resisted their roles or helped others in quiet ways. Some may have shown kindness to the enslaved, but power corrupts in every direction. When a system rewards you for controlling others, it becomes easy to justify even the worst actions. Female warriors were rare, but they existed. Some were buried with blades and battle gear. One woman buried in Birka, Sweden, was long thought to be male until DNA proved otherwise. She held a high rank and possibly led troops, but like her male counterparts, her victories often came at the cost of others' freedom and safety. Women could also participate in the slave economy. They bought and sold people. They managed markets. They negotiated prices for girls with specific looks or talents. A wealthy woman might own a dozen household slaves, including young girls who served as both workers and sexual companions for guests. There are records of women using slaves as gifts in marriage arrangements or dowries. Even religious women were not entirely separate from this system. Temple slaves were common, and female leaders helped assign them roles. Whether in prayer or punishment, power always flowed downward. The division between free and enslaved women was not only legal, it was emotional. A free woman might look at her slave and see nothing of herself. She had status. The slave did not. That gap allowed abuse without guilt, and it kept the system running smoothly. Parents raised daughters to continue these patterns. A young girl learned from her mother how to command, punish, and expect obedience. Her first taste of authority often came from how she treated a servant. Compassion was not encouraged. Discipline was, in some rare cases, enslaved women rose in rank. They were freed, married into wealth, or became favoured companions. But these stories were unusual. Most remained trapped, passed from hand to hand, while their mistresses grew old and respected. The Vikings told stories of gods and heroes, but the quiet truth is that many women lived and died in silence. Those with power protected it. Those without it were used to protect others. It is a cycle as old as war. Even during funeral rites, women played visible roles. They might weep loudly, recite blessings, or lead the sacrifice of another woman. These events were public and ritualized. The goal was to send the deceased into the afterlife with force and dominance. Women ensured this goal was met. At times, women were even executioners, not in battle, but in ceremony. They held the knife. They gave the orders. They lit the pyre. In Viking logic, this was part of duty, not cruelty. We often want the past to have clear heroes and villains, but history rarely cooperates. The same hands that braided a daughter's hair might also tie a rope around a slave's neck. The same woman who sang to her husband might send a message to have someone punished. There is no simple line between good and evil here. In Viking society, women could be powerful, but that power came at a cost. It required them to support a brutal hierarchy and accept violence as normal. Their safety, status, and success often depended on the suffering of others. That was the price of being free in a world built on chains. As we near the end of this journey through Viking beliefs and behaviours, One final layer remains. We've seen war, ritual, and law. But what about the private body? What did the Vikings believe about purity, healing, and sex as medicine? We will find out soon. There is a part of Viking life that rarely makes it into heroic tales or glossy museum exhibitions. It lies at the very beginning of life, in the moment when a child draws their first breath, or doesn't. While the stories of warriors and gods often celebrate strength and conquest, the silent fate of unwanted daughters reveals a colder side of Viking society. It begins with birth, and sometimes ends just minutes later. Among the many decisions a Viking family had to make, few were as brutal as what to do with a newborn girl. In an age of limited resources, social stratification, and survival-driven pragmatism, daughters were not always welcome. Particularly when born into poor or landless families, female infants were often seen as future burdens rather than blessings. If a girl could not contribute to inheritance, military strength, or alliances through marriage, she was considered expendable. Midwives and mothers sometimes made this decision quietly, wrapping the child and laying her outside the home in the cold. There, exposure to the elements would decide her fate. In many cases, it was a decision made without ceremony, driven by custom and desperation. It says a lot about a culture when the weather is tasked with doing its dirty work. This wasn't a spontaneous act of cruelty. It was normalized. Sagas and historical accounts mention these events without condemnation. They describe fathers who left the girl out, or mothers who didn't bother naming the baby. The act was part of the unspoken agreement between family and society. Viking society was deeply patriarchal, and gender roles were carved in stone. A male child was seen as a future warrior, farmer, or trader. He had the potential to protect, provide, and gain status. A female child, unless born to a powerful household, had fewer options. Her value depended on marriageability, dowry, and childbearing potential. If those weren't immediately promising, her life was in danger from the very first day. This preference wasn't universal. Some regions, particularly wealthier ones, had the means to raise daughters and even educate them. But the poorer settlements, especially in frontier lands or farming communities, could not afford that luxury. In those places, survival often required difficult decisions. The ritual of exposure wasn't unique to the Vikings. The Romans did it. The Greeks did it. Even later, European societies quietly practiced abandonment. Modern gender reveal parties may seem ridiculous, but at least they don't end in frostbite. It's strange how humans have always found ways to assign value to a life before it's even lived. Certain sagas mention children being left for the gods. While this might suggest a religious motive, it was more likely a way to ease the guilt. If the gods took the child, it wasn't murder, it was destiny. That's how people lived with decisions they knew were cruel but necessary for survival. The exposed babies were not always alone. Animals sometimes came, neighbours occasionally intervened. In rare cases, a passing stranger might take the child in. But these outcomes were exceptions. Most died within hours. The silence that followed was not grief. It was the absence of acknowledgement. I often wonder how many unnamed girls lie beneath the soil, forgotten by history, but once warm and alive like anyone else. They didn't make it to the sagas or the graves. They weren't buried with brooches or beads. They simply vanished. This practice wasn't state-sanctioned. There were no written laws requiring female infanticide, but there also weren't any laws protecting those infants. That silence allowed the tradition to continue unchecked. In communities that valued survival over sentiment, no one asked questions. One justification often used was population control. In remote settlements, food and warmth were limited. A household that could not support another mouth might see a girl as a drain. Sons could work fields or guard livestock by age 8. Daughters had fewer duties and more risk of becoming a dowry debt. This calculation wasn't always about economics. Sometimes it was about honour. A family that had too many daughters might appear weak or vulnerable. Marriage negotiations became complicated. Reputation mattered more than compassion. The fewer the daughters, the stronger the lineage seemed. In households that did raise daughters, expectations were high. Girls were trained early in domestic tasks, religious duties, and family loyalty. They were warned about behaviour, modesty, and obedience. The pressure to be useful began in childhood and never lifted. Some sagas depict women with immense power, but those were the exceptions. The queens, priestesses, and warriors stood atop a steep pyramid built on the backs of anonymous girls. The society needed a few strong women to symbolize order and fertility, but too many would disrupt the balance of inheritance and dominance. It's not so different today, in a world where female success is celebrated only if it doesn't threaten the existing hierarchy. We cheer for the exceptional woman, as long as she remains the exception. Archaeologists have tried to trace this part of Viking life through burial records. The problem is that infants left to die often weren't buried. They were not given ritual or marked graves. Their absence is the only record. Some scholars estimate that in certain regions, up to 1 in 5 girls may have been exposed. These numbers remain speculative, but they match what oral traditions suggest. Stories of mothers secretly protecting their daughters also exist. Some lied about gender, others fled with the baby. These acts of rebellion were small, quiet, and dangerous. The women who did them risked their standing and safety. Their stories were rarely passed down, but we can imagine them wrapped in wool cloaks, cradling their newborns in silence, hoping the night would protect them. The contrast between female power in Viking mythology and female vulnerability in Viking reality is striking. Goddesses were fierce. Human girls were disposable. The cultural imagination allowed strength, but the social fabric did not. This discrepancy extended into adult life. A woman who survived infancy still had to earn her place through usefulness and submission. She could not inherit land unless no male heir existed. She could not join the assembly. She could be sold into marriage, and she could be abandoned again if she failed to bear sons. The value of a Viking woman was not in her being, but in her function. Birth, marriage, and death all served a purpose larger than her own. Individuality was not celebrated. Conformity was survival. Sometimes I think the Viking world was less about heroism and more about making sure only certain people lived long enough to be remembered. The rest were footnotes, erased before they could write their names. We are almost at the end of this unsettling journey. There is just one final chapter left, one that ties everything together, from violence to law, from belief to burial. It is the legacy these practices left behind, and the message they carved into the bones of 1,000 years. Let's take one last look. Even after exploring the most extreme and shocking sexual customs of Viking life, there is still one more layer to peel back, a layer that feels unexpectedly modern, yet deeply rooted in the contradictions of the past. It is the Viking view of sexuality that did not fall into neat categories, and their understanding of gender roles that left room for some flexibility, while harshly punishing deviation. In particular, their attitudes toward homosexuality and gender fluidity reveal a world far more nuanced than we often expect from warriors and raiders. In Viking society, same-sex relations were not always condemned. In fact, a man who engaged in sexual activity with another man was not automatically shamed or punished. What mattered most was the role he played. If he was the one who took the dominant position, asserting control, masculinity, and conquest, then his actions were often viewed through the lens of power rather than deviance. It was not the act itself that brought disgrace, it was the position within that act. To be passive was to be weak, to be conquered, and to surrender masculinity. That role invited ridicule, insult, and even social exclusion. The words rega and ergi were insults that implied softness, femininity, or submission. These words could trigger violence or legal disputes. Being labelled with them was dangerous, not because of moral disgust, but because it questioned a man's role in society. It's amazing how something as private as intimacy could become a public referendum on your place in the social ladder. In this world, everything was political, even the bed. Sagas tell of men accusing others of being Aga, and how that accusation alone could lead to duels, killings, or lawsuits. If a man called another Aga and could not prove it, he could be punished. But if the claim was proven, the insulted man's reputation was ruined. This created a strange system where sexuality became a legal matter, a question of evidence, and an issue of social survival. What complicates this picture further is the presence of gods behaving in gender-fluid or same-sex ways. Loki, the trickster god, is famously known for shifting shapes, including turning into a mare and giving birth to a foal. In another tale, Odin learns the magical arts of sever, a form of sorcery associated with women. Practicing it could earn a man the label of unmanly. Even the All-Father was not immune to the judgments of Viking masculinity. The fact that Vikings could worship gender-bending gods while punishing effeminate men is one of history's great balancing acts. It seems they could admire flexibility in their deities, but not in each other. Among the Norse, there was a deep fear of anything that reversed roles. A man who gave up dominance was giving up more than pride. He was giving up control, honour, and legal standing. The passive role was seen not as an equal expression of love, but as a mark of social inferiority. The same logic applied to women too. Women who stepped too far into male spheres, especially in sexual matters, were often viewed with suspicion or hostility unless they were clearly operating within accepted boundaries like marriage or motherhood. That said, women in Viking society did enjoy more rights than many of their contemporaries in medieval Europe. They could inherit, own land, initiate divorce, and in rare cases, even lead raids or trade voyages. But those rights existed in parallel with deep-rooted gender expectations. Any sign of a man acting like a woman sexually was considered a threat to the whole order. Some scholars suggest that these views were shaped by the constant pressures of war and survival, a society that rewarded strength, conquest, and loyalty needed rigid markers to enforce order. By labelling passive sexual roles as shameful, they reinforced dominance and hierarchy. In many ways, sexuality was used as a tool to uphold the entire structure of Viking life. If you ever feel judged for your haircut today, just remember, Viking men could be legally killed for being too soft. That kind of peer pressure puts modern barbershop anxiety into perspective. What's most surprising is that despite these harsh attitudes, the language used in sagas and legal texts doesn't always carry the moral condemnation you might expect. There is little mention of sin or eternal punishment. Instead, the focus is on honour, shame, and social standing. It was not about morality in the religious sense. It was about functionality and roles. The Vikings had no centralised religious body to enforce purity laws, and their gods were too mischievous to serve as strict moral examples. Still, the fear of being labelled as weak or passive haunted many Viking men. These labels could be used in disputes, in political games, and even in poems that mocked enemies. Skaldic poetry, known for its sharp wit, often accused rivals of being unmanly in order to humiliate them. The lines between wordplay and warfare were thin. I find it troubling how much energy societies pour into policing gender roles, even when they claim to value strength and freedom. It seems that freedom, in practice, was reserved for those who followed the script. This rigidity affected not just individuals, but the community at large. If a man lost his honour, his family's reputation suffered, his children might be mocked, his household could lose status. The fear of being outed as weak was not about private shame, it was about public collapse. And yet, within all this harshness, the Vikings still told stories about gods who defied gender roles. They still carved images of shape-shifting creatures and honoured them in ritual. they still acknowledged that power sometimes came from unexpected places. The contradiction is telling. Perhaps it was their way of recognizing that life is rarely neat, that control is never total, that human nature slips between the cracks. In the end, Viking attitudes toward gender and homosexuality reveal a society that was both deeply structured and deeply conflicted. They used sexuality to sort people, to punish them, to elevate them, and to control them. But they also told stories that hinted at the instability of those very systems. That instability is what makes their world so fascinating. It reminds us that history is never just facts and dates. It is beliefs, rules, fears, and desires all woven together in the daily lives of people who are long gone, but still speak through their stories. We have now reached the end of this strange and unsettling journey. From blood-stained bedsheets to war-driven rituals, from legal documents to whispered accusations, from sagas of gods to trials of men, it has been a glimpse into a world where power, honour, and sex were inextricably linked. Perhaps the most shocking part of all is how much hasn't changed. Tonight, as you close your eyes, let the noise of axes and whispers fade. Drift past the longships, past the torch-lit halls, past the sharp tongues and broken rules. The past is quiet now. The stories are told. Sleep well.